The Futile Faked. Chapter 14. He'd been on the hunt all night. The coordinates they traced took them back to the boys' dorm room, then the clock tower, then nothing. The boy had found some other means of escape. Ground sweeps turned up nothing, no brooms had been recorded leaving the hastily erected perimeter wards. Even the two they'd captured at the scene, Jordan and Crouch Juniors, only knew as much as everyone else had witnessed. Moody was handling the investigation into this Voldemort person, budding Dark Lords were just his cup of tea. James was personally selected to head the search for the boy once known as Rigel Black. A half-blood masquerading as a pure-blood scion, fooling everyone in British society for, well, they really didn't know how long. The minister was embarrassed, which meant the hunt for RBC, the Rigel Black child, was his top priority. He'd begged off shift nearing noon the next morning, citing the need for sleep. He left the hastily compiled task force plotting a timeline and drafting lists of potential character witnesses. On his way out of the office, he chartered an emergency international portkey. The trainee on duty didn't question the coordinates, crazier things would be done in the midst of this mess. When he flew through to Potter's place to check in with Lily, Sirius met him at the grate. "Anything?" James shook his head. "He's in the wind." "What next?" Sirius rocked on his heels, looking one loud noise from bolting. James felt sick just imagining what he must be thinking. His son was missing, wanted for questioning in a case of blood identity theft, and Sirius had no idea how long ago the swap had been made. There was no way to know if Archie was complicit or incapacitated, or alive at all. It wasn't often his official responsibilities and family duties collided. James felt the tension in the line he walked as he removed his header badge and drew the portkey out of his pocket. "Harry." Sirius nodded, eyes shadowed. Harry was the only person closer to Archie than Sirius. If anyone other than Archie himself knew something about this doppelganger, it was she. "James." Lily came through the open doorway, Addie on her hip. James met her with an embrace, feeling the weight of the last 12 hours ease somewhat as she burrowed her face into his neck. "Is there any word?" "Not yet. I'm going to talk to Harry." "To America?" Lily drew back, a crease between her brows. "It can't wait until she's home next week." He shook his head sharply. "This is going to get out of control fast. There's already talk of blood testing the whole school, and only Sirius Lordship has shielded him from official questioning. That won't last. If there's anything Harry knows, anything she even suspects, I have to know. As her father, or as the headerer." He grimaced. "Both." Sirius put a hand on his shoulder. "Best we go." His voice held a harsh tremor, a frisson of horror that had not yet come to rest in his mind. Lily bit her lip, but nodded. "Quickly, then. You won't be the only ones to think of her." James pressed their foreheads together, bust at his cheek, and stepped back. He held out the other end of the portkey to Sirius, knowing it was unprofessional and potentially unwise to bring the shattered man along. He also knew if he didn't offer Sirius a direction, his friend would pursue an even less wise one on his own. Better Sirius felt he was part of the investigation. At the activation phrase, they were swept into the distorted shadow hand of magic and borne painfully through a rip in the world. Sirius heaved as they hit the manicured lawn of the American Institute of Magic. Cross-Atlantic portkeys carried a small risk of scrambling body parts, but it was the magical backlash that deterred most from resorting to such travel. Still, James winced to see the usually collected man so affected by international travel. His brother in all but blood was reeling, and it showed. Sirius kept what little there was in his stomach and pulled himself upright on shaking legs. James swept the dew from their robes and cast a glance around the unfamiliar grounds. He and Lily had seen it only in pictures. The main entrance was easy to spot, a set of handsome double doors shining in the early morning light, and he set off toward them at a brisk pace. A witch with Molly Weasley's build and stare met them at the entrance. She wore American-style short robes in heelers blue and took in his distinctively cut uniform swiftly, eyes lingering on the spot where his badge ought to hang. "What business does the British Ministry have at our school? I hope you know we require a warrant for any searches." James chose his words carefully. "Britain has no official business here yet. I've simply come to speak to my kid. Harry Potter. This is most unusual. The children have just started their final exams. I don't care, James said. Family emergency, Sirius put in softly. The witch looked between them somewhat mistrustfully. James could tell she didn't like the way Sirius' eyes shifted restlessly between her face and the school. I see. And do you have identification to prove your relationship, Mr. Potter? It's Lord Potter, Sirius muttered. If anything, the woman's face closed further. James gave an apologetic grimace and reached into his robes for his wand. It was internationally registered, as his work often took him abroad. Will this do? She took out her own wand and ran a standard identification charm. Mahogany, 11 inches, registered to a James Potter. Very well. She handed his wand back and produced a list out of thin air. After a moment's consultation, she said, Potter is taking his first exam in Auditorium 1B, right down the first hallway. James' heart stopped. They'd gotten to his little girl, too. James pushed past the witch at a sprint, ignoring her startled cry. He rounded the corner and flew down the corridor with darkness pushing the edges of his thoughts closer together. Faison won't get away. He burst into the lecture hall. A dozen heads looked up from their papers, but his gaze caught the one in the third row wearing his daughter's face. The professor shouted something, James didn't hear it. He took a bit of pleasure watching the boy scramble up from the bench as he stalked up the stairs toward him. Whatever he saw in James' face must have terrified him. I can explain. James levered the imposter up by his collar and growled. Where is she? One of the students, Hermione, of course, tried to stun him. James batted the spell away without loosening his grip. Put him down, the girl shrieked. Two other students grabbed her wand arm before she could hurl something stronger, but James had his focus entirely on the gasping body snatcher in his daughter's school robes. In 3 seconds, I'm going to forget I'm an error and you're going to regret the day you were born if you don't. The boy choked, hands scrambling at James' wrist. Please, Uncle J.A. James dropped him like a hot stone. Arch. Sirius came up the stairs beside him. James hated the way the hope clawed up into his friend's voice. The boy looked between them, swallowing against the pain in his throat convulsively. Dad. What's going on? Sirius fairly vibrated with conflicting impulses. His hand reached out shakily, but James held an arm between them. Security question, he snapped. Sirius licked his lips. What animals did I find in your room over winter holes? The green-eyed boy regarded them for a long moment, then said quietly, a fox and a raven. Sirius released a ragged sob and collapsed on his son, holding him as though he would never again let go. James was left to clench the air between his fists, everything he'd assumed re-evaluated between heartbeats. As Sirius cried into the boy's, Arch's AIM uniform, James tried not to imagine where his own child could be. Was she the imposter at Hogwarts? The idea was dizzying. Devastating. You're coming with us, Arch, he managed hoarsely. The professor protested once more. I demand you cease this violent interruption into our final examination, errors. Whatever business you have with Mr. Potter. Sirius let out a hiccuping laugh and James felt his expression fold into something dangerous. Before he could refute the woman, Archie pushed back from his father's embrace. Something's happened to Rigel, hasn't it? Is he dead? Archie's voice cracked on the last word and the fear in his eyes made James' stomach sink. He shook his head slowly, and the relief in Archie's face was staggering. Thank Merlin, the boy whispered. Hermione could contain herself no longer. She reached across Sirius to pull Archie a little closer toward her. What's happening, Harry? What are they talking about? If you don't want to go with them, I won't let them take you. Archie looked at the girl, willing to fight 2 grown wizards for him, and his eyes glistened. To James' frustration, the boy attempted a wry smile. Somehow, I thought it would be more dramatic than this. It was dramatic, I assure you, James bit out. Archie winced. He took his classmate's hand in both of his and let out a shaky breath. You're going to read some terrible things about me in the paper. Just know, it wasn't ever what they'll say it was, and I'll never regret coming here and being your friend. The girl scowled fiercely. Harry, what? That's not his name, James snapped. Harry is my daughter's name. But he is your daughter, Hermione said, still scowling. The contradiction in gender appeared to mean nothing to her. Archie squeezed her hand and shook his head. No, I'm not. My name is Archie, and I was never Harry Potter. Hermione took half a step back, visibly unnerved, and Archie dropped her hand. I'll explain it all in a letter, if you'll read it. First, he would be explaining it to his father, then him and Lily, then likely all of magical Britain. Hermione searched Archie's eyes for a long moment, and lifted her chin. I'll expect the letter on my desk by Monday morning. I promise, Archie whispered. James put a hand on his shoulder and steered him toward the door. Your exam, the professor said weakly, clearly unclear on what to do. The witch who had met them at the entrance put a hand on her colleague's arm and shook her head. From the sound of it, that's the least of his troubles. She met James' gaze with a steely challenge. Now that it has been established this is not your son, Mr. Potter, I'm no longer sure you have the right to remove him from our campus. He's my son, Sirius growled. He moved between the two witches and Archie faster than they could draw their wands. This is the heir to the House of Black and you will not be preventing his return to England. He's also a person of interest in an open investigation into blood identity theft. That's not a crime here in the States, the blue-robed healer argued. It was a crime where they committed it. Consider this a lawful extradition. He pulled out his badge and held it up for her scrutiny. The witch looked regretfully toward Archie, who shook his head quickly. It's all right, Healer Beechams. This is my dad and uncle, and I am in a lot of trouble. He fell into a deep bow. I'm very sorry for lying to you all these years. Years. The word struck James like a physical blow. He clamped down on the boy's shoulder and near dragged him the rest of the way out of the auditorium. As the doors swung shut behind them, he backed the boy up against the corridor wall and got right into his face. With a voice he'd never used on his nephew before, he demanded. Where is Harry? Archie's chin set stubbornly. If you don't know, then she's safe. Archie, James snarled. The mirror, Sirius put in quickly. Does she have it? Archie shook his head. No, we gave it to Rigel. Who is Rigel? What is going on, Archie? Sirius added, desperately confused, but increasingly present as his worst fears receded. Archie was the picture of miserable guilt. It's complicated. What happened at Hogwarts? In his relief and confusion, Sirius forgot the first rule of interrogation, give no information until you know the extent of their information. Some maniac crashed the last task and tried to drain his magic. Whatever game you were playing was blown right out the water when they realized he wasn't you. Archie had gone white again. Did they take Rigel's magic? We don't think so, considering he pulled down centuries-old wards and apparated away. Enough, Sirius James interrupted. Archie, who is that person? Is it? He had to ask. Is it Harry? Sirius' face fell into dismayed shock. No. No. Archie shook his head vigorously, suddenly full of information. No, it's just this kid we met. He wanted to go to Hogwarts, and I didn't really want to. Harry let me take her place here, and she... Where? James had to hold himself back from shaking the boy as he hesitated. Tell me where she is right now, Archirus Black, or so help me. Archie looked to the side, shame hooding his gaze. I don't know for certain, but she's usually in London. London? James gave Archie a flat look. Diagon Alley, he muttered. If you let me get my things from Pettingill, I have the address. James released him, fighting the relief in his chest that wanted to lull him into relaxation. His girl was fine. Probably wondering what to do next, but fine. In so much trouble she was never leaving the house again, but fine. And Archie was fine. So Sirius would be fine. The rest of it mattered less. Quickly he bit out. We have a return portkey in 20 minutes. I'll go with him. Sirius offered as though it weren't obvious he wasn't letting Archie out of his sight anytime soon. James made for the lawn, head down as he tried to reconcile everything Archie had just said with what had been revealed the night before. Some kid, and when had they even met and when had they switched, had taken Archie's place at Hogwarts. Archie was at AIM. And Harry was. His mind tallied everything in a single column. The guild internship. Her entrepreneurial ventures. All the time spent in Diagon Alley over the summer holes. The Hearst kid. Harry was brewing potions. It always came back to that. Archie and Sirius hurried back across the lawn. Archie was explaining something with a guilty tone. Haven't seen the paper yet this morning. Hermione and I were up all night studying for our finals, and I figured Rigel would give a ring on the mirror if anything this bad had happened. I don't know why he wouldn't warn me. So you haven't heard from him? James cut in sharply. Mirror's been quiet the past few days. Nothing seemed off when we spoke last. James grunted. Uncle James, I'm sorry this all. James shot him a dark look. I'm not prepared to take your apology until we find Harry. If anything's happened to her. Archie understood that he would never be forgiven unless Harry was all right. I take full responsibility. As the portkey lit from within, James heard him add under his breath, just as she would for me. -0. HP. -0. It was hours of flying before she was calm enough to change back. Well into the wild Scottish countryside, she collapsed in a heap of limp limbs and disheveled clothing. The leaves of the trees rustled just like the maze, sending shivers of energy down her spine. Rest was a luxury she had not yet earned. She pushed to her feet, straightened her robes, and turned on the spot. Again and again, gasping for breath between each jump like a sprinter running consecutive races. When the black edges of her vision receded, she jumped again, knowing even as she ran against the clock that her deadline was no clear thing. Archie was the only one who could tell them where she would be. It would take time for anyone to figure out he was at AIM. She may have to lay low for several days before Archie realized what had happened and came forward. She dared not use the mirror, it was exploitable by a priori magic. While conversations couldn't be replayed, the right spell would reveal how often and for how long the mirrors were connected. Archie had to retain plausible deniability. Communicating with Rigel after he was revealed a felon would not help his case. She had to trust her cousin would follow their plan. Hours later, Harry leaned against the crumbling wall of an alley in downtown London. The sun threatened to rise at any moment. Her legs trembled in the wake of the chain apparition, but there was no time to strengthen them. She pulled her cloak, temporarily spelled to appear a nondescript grey, tighter around her as she stepped shakily out onto the street. The hood was deep and too heavy to blow in the wind, it easily shadowed a face that no longer served any purpose. The leaky cauldron was sparsely populated at the early hour, but every customer she passed had their face in a newspaper. She tried not to look, but the headline, "Hogwarts Half-Blood Flees the Scene, Who is RBC?" shouted at her. The picture was blurry, but it showed her fingers curled into claws as she tore through the ward's imprisoning. She hurried out of the pub, breathing heavily through her nose to keep the dizziness at bay. Diagon Alley was similarly depopulated. She moved as quickly as she dared along the long street, keeping her eyes to the cobblestones. As she passed the intersection where one of the great mirrors had been established for the tournament, she had to consciously resist the urge to hunch guiltily. A hastily draped length of fabric did not disguise what had happened. Broken glass littered the street. Someone had shattered it. Harry moved past it with a purpose and didn't pause until she reached the steps of Gringotts. The goblin at the door held his spear across it when she tried to enter. No withdrawals today. She put some gravel in her voice as she asked, "Why not?" "Anti-volatility measure." Due to recent political events, the goblin drawled. "That's fine. I'm here to deposit." He peered distrustfully into the shadows of her hood, but stood aside. She was approached by one of the tellers as soon as she entered. That alone was unusual enough to tell her the goblins were unnerved. "Business?" he asked briskly. "I'd like to deposit something in my family vault." "Name?" "Potter." "Wand?" She faltered. Her wand was registered to Archie's name. Instead, she held out a bare hand. "Will blood suffice?" He sliced her palm with the tip of his spear. "Wait here." She hadn't been to her family vault since she was a small child, and never without her parents. Her personal vault was a low-security option, close to the surface, and not requiring identification beyond an account number and signature. That trip would not suffice for what she had to do. The goblin returned with a clean spear, evidently satisfied by the tests they'd run. "Right this way, Miss Potter." She climbed into the cart he specified. As he climbed in after her, she saw his nostrils flare and wondered if he could smell the blood on her clothes. She curled into herself and ignored his stare. The cart took off with a rattling jerk and plummeted into the darkness. It was a much longer ride than she was used to. Torches appeared only sporadically to throw their surroundings into sharp relief. She had brief impressions of honeycomb caverns, ornately carved pillars, and the heat of recent dragon fire. Then they turned a corner, and a waterfall splashed down over the cart, soaking them both. The cart screeched to a halt and Harry had to gulp air desperately and brace against the rail to keep from hurling. The nausea was much worse than she expected. It felt as though a colony of peaceful snakes in her belly had been tossed like low mine. When it passed, Harry shook the thief's downfall from her eyes and looked up. The goblin had his spear at her throat. "Reveal yourself, imposter." She raised a hand slowly to grasp the edge of the cloak and pushed it back. The goblin's expression did not change, nor did he strike. Harry gave a vapid smile. Can you blame a girl for her beauty charms? All such magic must be disclosed prior to visiting the deep vaults. I forgot, she said with a sniff. You already tested my blood. Do you really want to test it again? The goblin scowled at her, but retreated to his side of the cart and touched a pendant around his neck. The cart took off again, slowly at first, but with increasing speed. Harry drew her hood back over her face, trying not to think about how different her hair felt beneath her fingers as she tucked it away. She felt a little bit drunk, all the weight in her body having shifted subtly beneath her clothes, and the jostling cart was not helping the feeling of being suddenly off balance. The goblin yanked on the handle and the cart screeched in a piercing protest as it came to rest before the Potter family vault. Harry nearly tripped getting out of the vehicle. There was an inch of extra room in her boots now, and her limbs felt as ungainly as a newborn colt's. She made a show of digging in her bag, stomping her foot in irritation, and turning back to the cart with a flourish. I forgot to put it in my bag. Ah. You will not be entering the vault, the goblin growled. His irritation was not an act. Sorry, no. I'll have to come back another time. She didn't know for certain, but she thought the cart took off even faster on the way back up. The sun was fully risen when she stepped blinking through the marble doors. Diagon bustled, an unspoken tension thrumming beneath its usual energy, or perhaps that was Harry, projecting her own turmoil outward. She peered with a frown up the long street until she realized she was straining her eyes hard enough to give herself a headache. Merlin, I forgot how poor my vision was. She'd have to hope she had a pair of glasses at her flat. She kept the hood up, but wasn't too worried about anyone catching sight of her face. No one could connect her with Rigel Black now. Her feet found the familiar turn-down Nocturne alley. She took the less commonly used alleys on her way to Dogwood Lane and didn't see anyone she knew. On the other side of Cyprioth Court, she felt most of the anxiety drain from her shoulders. She stopped at the nearest market and bought a bag of basic pantry items without bargaining. At the corner of Dogwood Lane, she loitered unobtrusively until she was sure none of her neighbors had their windows open. She stole up the steps to her apartment and fit the rarely used key into the dusty lock with difficulty. Finally, she shut the door behind her and sank to the floor. Her head came to rest against her knees, and she took several long breaths. Part of her had trouble accepting that she'd actually made it. The rest of her had been stuck on a loop since the lights of Hogwarts fell away beneath her. It was over. Everything was over. And yet, there was still work to do. Harry dragged herself upright. The food went to the cupboards, a couple pieces of fruit artfully displayed on the counter. She pulled down a dish and placed it in the sink as though dirty. In the bedroom she dug out a set of clothes Flint's mother had left behind. Relieved that she wouldn't have to conjure anything, she started the shower in the bathroom and shucked the filthy garments from her back as the pipes groaned. She vanished them as they hit the floor. It stung to lose the jersey the twins had given her, the gloves from Blaze, and Edmund and Alden's cloak, but that small pain was barely a breeze in the hurricane of hurt that was her heart. Nearly everything she wore as Rigel had to go. She took the beacon from her ear and what was left of the amulet from around her neck, carefully placing them in her bag with the other items she couldn't bear to destroy. Draco's gauntlets went in there, too, nested with the invisibility cloak, map, and mirror. The watch from Archie. Her wand. All of it would be wrapped in moleskin, hidden away until the world no longer searched for Rigel Black. Harry sank to her knees on the bathroom floor, a boot in each hand. She knew she had to, but... Are you crying over your shoes? Shut up, Dom. She shook the tears from her cheeks and vanished them both ruthlessly. Her fingers closed over air and she drew another long breath. She was just tired, that was all. She'd get a new pair of boots, a set untainted by Rigel's history. The steam was visible in the air, so she pushed herself upright again and stepped gingerly into the spray. The water swept over her, erasing the last vestiges of Rigel from her skin. The sweat, blood, and tears of 4 long years circled the drain almost indifferently. Sharp stinging drew her attention to every scrape and gash, and though she didn't recognize the body she inhabited, she healed it carefully. She left the shower's thrall after she fell asleep standing up. Mrs. Flint's clothes didn't fit perfectly, but they were close enough to resize. She ran her fingers through her hair compulsively, eyeing the fogged-over mirror with trepidation. She couldn't avoid her reflection forever. Her hand slid through the condensation smoothly, and Harriet Potter looked back at her, a girl caught unaware. Her eyes. Had they always been so bright? Against a bloodshot red backdrop, her natural green looked as vibrant as an emerald. Her mother's bone structure peeked out from beneath soft cheeks, and a full lower lip gave her a somewhat dissatisfied moo. No one could mistake this girl for a boy. She supposed that was good, all things considered. Her fingers went to work on the tangles in her hair, the same length but so much curlier, now. She was no hairdresser, but she flipped the part to the opposite side and coaxed the tiniest of growing charms into the tresses to try and cover the way some of it had been sheared. It flopped into her face annoyingly, and for a brief moment she wished Pansy was there to plait it back. The girl in the mirror pressed her lips together. Pansy would never touch her hair again. Harry hefted her potions kit and took it to the living room to repack. Everything associated with Rigel went in a moleskin wrapping at the very bottom of an undetectably extended pocket, and she reorganized the rest of the bag almost automatically. While she was at it, she pulled out a handful of ingredients for a basic strengthening brew and set them on the coffee table. She had a couple of cauldrons in the cupboard. It took no time at all to set one up in the living room and toss together the base of the potion. With a timer set to the second stage, she curled up on the sofa and sank into its lulling embrace. She could afford a few hours rest. Maybe there were things she was forgetting, but her brain was too knackered to hold out any longer. Sleep was what she needed. Everything else could wait. The front door slamming into its jam startled her from a dead sleep. Harry tried to summon her wand blearily before she remembered it was packed away in moleskin. She pushed the hair out of her face and froze at the sight of her father silhouetted in righteous anger on her doorstep. "What's, Dad?" She made a show of stumbling upright, checking the still simmering cauldron out of the corner of her eye as she stepped toward James uncertainly. The surprise was real, at least, he'd found her much more quickly than she anticipated. She spotted Archie and Sirius on the stairs behind James and allowed her face to fall. "Oh, shite. Harry." James stared, some of the wind seeming to have escaped his sails at the sight of her. His eyes traced her face, got stuck on her eyes, and finally blinked hard. "What does Lily crave when she's pregnant?" "Ice mice." James released a long breath and ducked into the small flat. "Thank God, Rick." "What's happened?" She looked to Archie, whose expression of utter guilt and misery meant he'd at least partially confessed to the ruse. Her cousin summoned a grimace as he and Sirius crowded into the living room. "You didn't even watch the task." "Can't be seen out of school," she muttered, eyes tightening. "Is Rigel okay?" "He's gone," Archie said, widening his eyes as though he couldn't quite believe it. Maybe he couldn't, Harry was definitely still processing all that had occurred. "Gone? What do you mean?" "Enough. We are not here to chat, Harry." James leveled his look at her, and Harry affected an appropriately chagrined expression in return. "What in the 7 hells is going on? Why are you here and not at school?" She glanced at Archie, who tucked his chin in the barest of nods. "I've always been here. Since first year." Sirius made a startled noise. "That long?" I thought it was just for the tournament. Archie shook his head slowly. We switched before leaving for school, 4 years ago. So all the letters I wrote. Sirius was pale, his tone just a hair short of accusatory. Archie's face crumpled with grief. Rigel always forwarded them to me. But anything about being at Hogwarts was a lie. We've both been lying, Harry offered, trying to take the mountain of guilt from Archie's shoulders. To all of you. I'm sorry for the lying, but I can't say I'm sorry to have let Archie take my place at AIM. James scoffed. I'm sure you had a grand time skiving, Harry, but schools exist for a reason. There are things you have to learn, no matter how much you don't want to. I've learned plenty, she shot back, the picture of offended youth. I'm years ahead of my peers in coursework. You think I'm upset about the coursework? James gestured to the apartment with an exasperated scowl. Harry, you're living in the lower alleys. 4 years with no supervision, do you have any idea what might have happened? I'm fine though, Dad. Nothing happened. Fine. You're fine. He repeated the word as though it was stuck in his teeth. Well, the rest of us aren't fine. Nothing is fine, Harry, because there's an international manhunt and our family is about to be caught in the crosshairs. Prongs. Sirius put a hand on James' shoulder and waited until his friend had visibly calmed before turning to Harry and Archie and asking, who was going to Hogwarts in Archie's place. He leveled them with an earnest stare. It's important that we know. This is bigger than you probably understand right now. Harry creased her forehead in a perplexed frown. He said it was better if we didn't know his name. He approached you? James asked sharply. Well, Archie met him at Junior Quidditch League the spring before school. Archie picked up the thread of the story with a nod. Yeah, we were in the medic tent together. I had to get my arm patched up, and he was icing his shoulder. We got to talking about schools, and he was envious that I got to go to a school like Hogwarts. Said his family had fallen on hard times and couldn't afford to send him to their ancestral school, so he was being homeschooled. I felt bad for him, but didn't really think much of it. Then. It was my idea, Harry confessed. I didn't want to go to AIM. Their potions program is garbage. I knew I could learn more on my own. Archie did want to go to AIM, though. But people would notice if he never showed up at Hogwarts. So, I thought, what if there was someone who wanted to go to Hogwarts, but couldn't? And I remembered that other kid. Archie put in. I found him at the next match and just asked him point blank if he wanted to go to Hogwarts. And he said yes. Sirius and James exchanged disbelieving looks. You just asked some random kid you met at the International Quidditch League to pretend to be you for 4 years. 7 years, Harry said, diplomatically ignoring the way her father's face darkened. And yeah, pretty much. I mean, at first we weren't taking it too seriously. Archie rubbed his neck sheepishly. We exchanged letters, and it was almost like a game. We talked and talked about it, until it just didn't seem so crazy. By the end of the summer, when I couldn't convince you to let me go with Harry, we just did it. What address did you send the letters to? What name did you use? James ticked the questions off his fingers. What team was he playing for? What? All right, Uncle James, slow down, Archie said. Let me think. When we met, I think he said his name was Romeo. Romello. Something with an R, that's why it was easier for him to use my middle name. We didn't use real names in our letters, though. He was Rook, Rigel supplied. Archie nodded. I was Knight and you were Bishop. Yeah. We used post office addresses. Harry would pick up and mail our letters from the Diagon Alley post when she went to the apothecary. We sent his to the post office in Paris, but it took weeks to get an answer sometimes. I'm not sure he lived near there at all. She said it thoughtfully, as though she hadn't considered the matter very carefully before. So he played for one of the French teams. James clarified. He had a notebook out and had jotted down every detail they relayed. Archie scrunched up his face. Maybe. Which one had a big cat as a mascot? A tiger, or maybe a lion? Or maybe the team was from Lyon. It was definitely blue and white. Or blue and yellow. I think. Was he in your age bracket? Sirius asked. He had a suspicious glint in his eye. They exchanged a bemused glance. Archie shook his head. No, I think he was at least one above me. He was definitely older, Harry confirmed. She pretended not to notice the way Sirius' face hardened. James dutifully wrote it down. Did he have an accent? A slight one, maybe, but by the time we met again to make the switch, I think it was gone. I don't remember it very well, though. It was so long ago, Archie said mournfully. We never thought it would go so far, but once we did it, there was really no turning back. Harry drew their attention with an earnest sigh. We thought it was the perfect solution. You'd think Archie was at Hogwarts, that I was at AIM, and we all got what we wanted. What was the harm? He was a half-blood, James growled. She froze. Her eyes darted between the two adults frantically. Oh. Archie paled several shades, and she wondered if he'd used his metamorphism to make it so dramatic. That's. Neglected to mention that, did he? Harry winced. Did they arrest him? He ran. She winced again. I am starting to appreciate the amount of trouble we're in. Welcome to the program. Get your things. Harry blinked. She looked over at her potion. Can I just? The cauldron exploded. Archie yelped and Harry shielded just in time to avoid singing. James regained control of his magic with an audible growl and Harry frowned reproachfully as the potion seeped over the floorboards. I've got downstairs neighbors, Dad, she muttered, vanishing the mess with a wave of her hand. You use magic outside of school, too? Do you have wards up? James asked gruffly. Technically, I'm enrolled in a correspondence course, so I can just say I'm practicing. Right. Is this grate connected? James started toward the flue. As he was reaching for the powder pot, a knock came at the door. Harry hurried to answer it before her father or uncle could. It was Mrs. Botting. All right, Harry. Heard some shouting, and then it sounded like some crockery might have been dropped. The woman eyed James' robes suspiciously. Everything's fine, Mrs. Botting. My family found out I haven't been at proper school all this time, like I said. She widened her eyes as she said it, and hoped the woman would understand. They've just come to take me home. Her eyes flitted from James to Harry and back, calculating. I see. I'll just lock up for you then. She gestured vaguely toward the door, but two of her fingers crossed in a question. Trouble? Thank you, Harry said with a polite smile. Sorry to disturb you. As she turned toward the flue with the others, she made a thief sign behind her back. All is well. How true that turned out to be remained to be seen. -0. HP. -0. James marched them into the living room like prisoners of war. They didn't need pillories around their necks to hang their heads at the sight of Lily and Remus' shocked and concerned faces. Archie. You're, Harry. Why do you look so? Lily reached out a tentative hand toward Harry's face. Where did you find him? With Harry. Remus asked. He took Archie in a hard embrace. We were worried sick, son. I'm sorry, Archie said into his uncle's robes. We're both sorry, Harry added, nudged by her father. You look like Lily, Remus said wonderingly, getting a proper look at her new features. But we just saw you a few months ago. That was me, Archie muttered. I've always looked like this. Harry glanced between Lily and Remus, guilt eating a hole in her stomach. Somehow, confessing to them was exponentially worse than James and Sirius. What do you mean? Lily demanded, a frown beginning to trace its way across her lovely brow. James cleared his throat pointedly, and Archie sent her a pleading glance. Harry withheld a sigh. It was on her, then. The last 4 years, Archie and I have been involved in something unwise. We did a dangerous thing, and what's worse, we lied to you all about it. Mum, I never went to AIM. I let Archie take my place there, so I could focus on my potions. She's been living in Nocturne Alley, James cut in. Lily's lips parted on a sharp inhale, and Harry shot her father a scowl. Not on Nocturne. I live in a perfectly respectable neighborhood south of the alleys. Rumus set his mouth in a hard line, and she could tell exactly what he was thinking, that he'd kept a bigger secret for her than he intended. Her mother was only able to blurt one question. "But what about your O.W.L.S?" Harry shifted uncomfortably. "I can still take them. I'm enrolled in the correspondence course." Lily's face settled into understanding. "Oh, Harry. That's no equal to a real education." "That's all you have to say?" Sirius exclaimed. "Lils, our children have been living an elaborate charade right in front of our eyes for years. Archie's never even set foot in Hogwarts." "I did go to the Yule Ball," as Harry Archie corrected him. "You, what?" Sirius was easily derailed. "But how?" He gestured to Archie's rather masculine physique and spluttered, "Polyjuice." "Only I had to take Polyjuice," Harry said. "You both changed your appearance to match Rigel's." James consulted his notebook with a frown. "Who is Rigel?" "Not Archie, I take it." Rumus rubbed his temple. "A kid we met at the Junior Quidditch League." Harry withstood Rumus' disbelieving stare with guileless alacrity. "He wanted to go to Hogwarts, and that was exactly what we needed for our plan to work." "How convenient," Rumus said slowly. "It did take some convincing," Archie admitted. "His was the most dangerous part of the ruse." "The ruse?" Sirius snorted. "Think a lot of your little lie, don't you? It snowballed into a capital R ruse rather quickly, Dad." "Of course it did," Lily said. Her eyes were lit with terrible calculation. "To fool even us for so long, Harry, I've seen you heal. Did you learn that to keep the cover story intact?" Harry nodded, surprised her mother had picked up on the logical consequences so swiftly. Sirius was quick on the uptake, too. "I'm certain I overheard you speaking Parseltongue with the snakes, Arch. But that was something the other kid could do, or at least he claimed to." Archie flushed. "I was faking. I can't speak Parseltongue at all. After Rigel's defeat of the basilisk was widely known, I had no choice." "If anything," Sirius looked vaguely relieved. He clapped his hands together and let out a shout as the next realization hit. "And you were never sorted into Slytherin. In retrospect, it's so obvious." Harry kept her mouth shut, and did not roll her eyes even a little bit. "And you can't outdo Eleanor, either, I suppose?" Rumus said quietly. His eyes flickered to Harry very briefly, and she could see the question forming in his eyes. "Definitely not." Archie shook his head vigorously. "Harry and Rigel trained endlessly in the alleys over summer break, but I was at that internship." "The healing internship," Sirius groaned. "So I couldn't practice with them." "You met up with this kid over the holidays, too?" James asked, pen poised. He was using the others as a foil, Harry realized. The interrogation was still happening, only their guard was that much lower with Rumus and Lily in the room. "Sure, we had to switch pretty often," Archie confirmed. "All the events Rigel kept getting invited to, every time we went to or came home from school, plus meetups with Hermione, I don't even remember all the times we switched." "But when did you physically switch?" Rumus asked, consternated. "And we would have noticed you taking Polyjuice for weeks at a time, wouldn't we?" The uncertainty in his voice was reflected on all the adults' face, and it was like a cloud settling over the room. Archie shifted his weight in the silence that followed. "My gift might be slightly less passive than I let on." He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let his metamorphism go all at once. It was Sirius' turn to gasp, and Harry winced to see his eyes well up in an instant. "You look." He gulped, and took Archie's head in both his hands. "You have Diana's chin." Archie burst into tears. Addie wailed from the other room, evidently woken from her nap. Lily rushed to soothe the child, and James scrawled the word metamorphmagus so hard into his notebook it scratched through to the next page. "What about you, Harry?" Rumus asked quietly. Sirius and Archie were stuck in an embrace, oblivious to anything but one another's pain. "What about me?" she asked as Lily came back into the room with a sniffling toddler. "How did we not notice you taking Polyjuice for 4 summers? And why would you have to change appearance at all?" Rumus fixed her with a hard look. "If you were mostly out of the picture, surely Archie's morphing would have been enough to cover for this other boy at events." Harry held her face impassive, but silently cursed Rumor's perceptive nature. At first, we were worried someone who knew Archie in America but lived in Britain would see a picture of me or run into Archie at the airport with my parents and figure out something was up. Best if I looked however Archie looked at school, which means the easiest way was to have just one face, and 3 people. Easiest, Rumors repeated, unconvinced. And the polyjuice. He really wasn't going to let that one go. I improved the recipe, Harry said. My version lasts as long as I want it to. Harriet Potter, do not tell me you're dosing yourself with experimental potions again. Lily shot her a massively disapproving look over at his head. It's perfectly safe. As far as she knew. I didn't use it to change my biological sex, anyway. Oh. Mollified, Lily nodded. It does sound as though you considered the potential ramifications, then. Does it? James skewered them all with a glare. When you're all done being impressed with our junior criminals, can we discuss the particular ramifications I'm concerned with? We didn't know he wasn't a pureblood, Archie said earnestly. They can't really charge us with aiding and abetting, can they? Whether they can or can't remains to be seen, but you must believe they are going to try, Archie. The minister is not pleased. Riddle is fit to be tied, and the international community is in an absolute uproar. James started to pace, but Lily put a hand on his arm. They couldn't have predicted this, she said quietly. I don't condone it. But well, how many of us dreamed of a different path? If someone had offered me a seat at Hogwarts when I was 11, even if I had to change myself drastically, I'm not sure I wouldn't have done it. James gave her a betrayed look. Lily lifted her lips in a small smile. You couldn't really understand, darling. It was never in doubt for you. Harry had never felt closer to her mother than in that moment, as she forgave a boy who didn't exist. And anyway, Harry didn't do anything, Archie insisted. I'm the only one who officially abetted him. Harry just homeschooled herself and lied to her parents. Which I feel terrible about, Harry added. Me, too. Archie turned to Sirius, who couldn't seem to stop tracing his features with bright eyes. Dad, it was horrible lying to you, but I had to follow my heart. I know I'm meant to be a healer. Rumors stifled an incredulous chuckle and breathed, you really do get the children you raise. Sirius raised an eyebrow at his friend. And what's your excuse, werewolf? You were at school with this other kid for a whole year. Rumor's smile dropped. You're right, but he smelled like Archie. A spark of slyness kindled in Archie's eyes. Fooled you, huh? He sounded like you, too, Rumors muttered, eyes narrowed. We made a perfume of Archie's sweat and mailed it to him, Harry explained. James put his head in his hands and shook it slowly back and forth. Sirius just snorted. Rumors, you useless pile of fur, did you think he never showered? He's a teenager. Rumors' ears turned pink and he crossed his arms. I'm never going to live this down. Anyone would be fooled by one of Harry's concoctions, Uncle Rumors. She's a genius. You'd both better hope you're as smart as you think, James said flatly. He pulled out his pocket watch and grimaced. I can't delay any longer, Arch. I have to take you to the ministry before the search for the missing black heir gets out of hand. The prophet says they've posted pictures of Rigel all across Scotland, Lily relayed. Harry frowned. Why would they expect him to stay there? Her mother gave her a patient look. He's 14. Young wizards can manage perhaps a few miles at a time, but not as many consecutive jumps as would be needed to get as far as Northern Ireland or Northumberland in less than a day. He burned a lot of magic in the maze, too, Rumors said thoughtfully. Not to mention what happened after. Had she? Harry couldn't recall doing anything too strenuous in the maze itself, and while the wards had been grounded strongly, she'd felt the anchor loose even as she pulled on them. Archie sent her a hard-to-read look. She dropped her gaze in the facsimile of a nod. It wouldn't do them any good to have the search for Rigel Black happening close to home. You shouldn't underestimate him. Archie said firmly. For one, he's not 14, he may even be fully of age for all we know. And he's known he might have to run for years, Harry added. To think he'd have no escape plan, I wouldn't make that assumption. James' face hardened. You're saying he could be anywhere? Kids, now is not the time to try and protect this person. We're just saying if you ignore everything he's done over the last 4 years, you'll never find him. Archie looked between the adults with perfect consternation on his face. This is the guy who slew a basilisk. He faced down a dragon, outdueled half a dozen rivals, for Merlin's sake. Dad said he tore down the Founder's wards. He what? Harry tried to turn her alarm into detached amazement, but wasn't sure how well she succeeded if the warning flash in Archie's eyes was any indication. Dumbledore had unraveled the lodestone already. James had a faraway look in his eyes. Still, it was no small feat. I'd assumed he was running on fumes when we lost his trail, but perhaps we'll distribute those posters a bit further afield. Not that there's anyone in the world who doesn't know what he looks like, Sirius put in helpfully. Really, you're just advertising the fact that he's wanted. Poor boy, Lily murmured, holding Addie close. He'll never know a moment's peace. He'll lie low for a while, then change his name, Remus predicted. And his face. There are plenty of ways. Sirius clamped a hand down on his son's shoulder and his smile became slightly sharp. These two figured that out. They both winced. Archie put a hand up to grasp Sirius briefly, taking a long breath and letting it out slowly. We should go, Uncle James. James nodded, and Harry looked at her father carefully. Just Archie. He's the only one I have proof committed a crime, so, yes. Will I be able to go back to school after? Archie asked. Let's focus on keeping you out of prison, first. Archie stepped toward the flu room, Sirius a beat behind him. James looked for a moment as though he would argue, but whatever he saw in Sirius' face dissuaded him. Harry tried not to worry too much. She had faith in Archie. He already had plausible deniability going for him, and the protection of his blood wasn't nothing. All he had to do was stick to their story. In their absence, Remus and Lily turned their attention to her in one coordinated movement, and she abruptly realized her own interrogation was just beginning. -0. AB. -0. His head hadn't stopped spinning since Uncle James burst into his exam room and everything fell to pieces. Predetermined pieces, like glass that had been carefully scored, but pieces all the same. Merlin bless Harriet Potter. He didn't know how she'd done it, how she'd slipped the security perimeter around Hogwarts, how she'd even survived what sounded like a harrowing disaster of a final task with her magic intact, but she did. There she was napping, perfectly bliss, when they descended on her place in the alleys. Everything Harry did seemed impossibly effortless. Even Archie couldn't see the ghosts in her eyes anymore. The flu didn't help matters in his head. He stumbled out of the grate and opened his eyes, only to slam them shut again as a dozen cameras flashed in his face. A hand came down hard on his shoulder and steered him forward. Archie felt his feet move automatically as the spots in his vision receded. Reporters. They must have recognized Uncle James when he came through. A reporter, can you comment? Are you heading the investigation into the Rigel Black case? Is this the imposter? Sirius spoke loudly over the clamoring crowd in the ministry lobby. This is my son, Archerius Black, and he is not available for comment. Cameras flashed again, and Archie did his best not to vomit. Were you too afraid to fight in the tournament, son? Is the Black Heir under arrest? A reporter. Uncle James pushed through the throng and pitched his voice in a tone that brooked no argument. Make way, people. We have a lot of paperwork to do today. Astonishingly, the wry remark gained a smattering of chuckles. As the reporters cleared a path for James, Archie realized they liked him. He didn't think reporters liked anyone. Does he know where Rigel Black is? How long did this impersonation last? Sirius steered him quickly toward the lifts, and Archie felt his hands unclench as the doors closed between them and the story-hungry journalists. Uncle James tapped his foot restlessly as the dial crawled toward level 2. Have they been waiting here all night? Archie asked quietly. Most likely, James confirmed. With a sideways look, he added. This isn't just some schoolboy hijinks, Arch. What that boy did, what you helped him do, is going to ripple through our world for years. Archie blinked the moisture back from his eyes. We didn't set out to change the world, he whispered. What you intended no longer matters. The lift chimed and a woman's voice droned, Department of Magical Law Enforcement. James stepped off with Shorty, Sirius and Archie behind him. Down the long hallway, through the heavy oak doors into the Aero Department talent pool. Heads craned from every cubicle they passed, but no one dared to call out when they caught the look on their boss's face. Weber. A round-faced young man popped up from the cubicle at the end of the row like a startled meerkat. Yes, sir. Coffee. The younger trainee, by the cut of his robes, scrambled to the break room. James started for his office, but the door swung outward before he reached it. A grizzled Aero with piercing blue eyes and a suspicious expression stepped out, closely followed by a man Archie recognized easily, the Minister of Magic. Potter. Did you catch him? Fudge peered around James with a calculating squint. Archie held very still, even as he felt Sirius bristle behind him like a cornered canine. No, Minister. James' voice was firm and quiet, as though he didn't know every Aero in the pit held their breath to better hear. The boy who impersonated my nephew is still at large. Still at, who's this then? A classmate. Does he know something? Fudge's voice rose with each question, audibly impatient. James took one step to the side and fixed Archie with a stare that said, I'm not going to make this easy for you. Archie cleared his throat and lifted his chin. I am the real Archirus Black, Minister. Fudge looked between Archie and Sirius for a long moment. Ah. I do see the resemblance. At least one person has been found today. Quite confident this is the real one, are you? Archie could hear his father's teeth creak. We're certain, Minister James said. If you'll excuse us, Mr. Black has a number of questions to answer. The minister spluttered. But surely you're not going to interrogate him yourself, Potter. He looked around at the grizzled Aero and the young trainee who hovered awkwardly with a steaming mug. Isn't that a conflict of interest? James set his jaw, but bowed his head ever so slightly. Indeed. I am merely his escort. James, Sirius began. A sharp gesture cut him off. The minister is correct, Sirius. It would be entirely inappropriate for me to participate in questioning. Moody, can you spare an hour? Aero Moody's gaze could have flayed mutton. I have real dark wizards to hunt. He stalked past their group with one last, dismissive look in Archie's direction. Shame about the other kid. He was really something. Archie tried not to take that comment personally. James claimed his coffee and took a long swig while the relieved trainee slunk back to his desk. He pivoted sharply and caught sight of someone too slow in ducking. Shacklebolt. Get your shiny head over here. A broad-shouldered Aero with a gold hoop in one ear rose from his cubicle unhurriedly. When he spoke, it was in a low, measured tone. Yes, sir. Interrogation room 3, 15 minutes. Shacklebolt tilted his head agreeably. Want me to book him? I'll do it, James muttered. Archie followed his uncle to a room down the hall, where he was somewhat unceremoniously searched and scanned. All the while, James intoned a long list of warnings and caveats that Archie didn't fully understand. He felt a bit dazed by the surrealness of the experience. Often, he had imagined it all going wrong. He pictured himself in Azkaban, sometimes, cold and afraid, but this brusque, barely human interaction with his own uncle was in some ways stranger. Can use anything you say against you, against Rigel, and against anyone else implicated. His wand went into a box along with his spare testing quill. Does not amount to suspension of your right to self-defense or counsel. His school uniform was swapped for a plain set of grey utility robes. Use of veritaserum on minors is strictly prohibited, but a written statement on spelled parchment will be. Uncle James, am I going home? Archie interrupted, clenching his toes in the two big shoes he was issued. Of course you are, Sirius said fiercely. James did not agree right away. If a Shacklebolt finds no reason to detain you. If he didn't confess to an imprisonable offense, in other words. Archie nodded. James signed his name to the paperwork he was filling out with an angry flourish. Sirius, fill out the rest of the demographics while you wait. Wait. Sirius clutched Archie's shoulders in both hands. James shook his head slowly. He has to do this part alone, Sirius. If there's any hint of nepotism, he'll never shake this. Archie pulled free of his father's embrace. Uncle James is right, Dad. I have to answer for this. Sirius took a deep breath. Then another. Then a shorter one, a faster one, and the next thing Archie knew his father was hyperventilating and James was half supporting him. I can't. Sirius, breathe. Dad. Archie dug for his wand and pushed his magic into his father's airways without permission. It was the simplest thing to convert excess oxygen to carbon dioxide. Less simple was facing the devastating fear in his father's eyes. I see, can't he lose you, Arch, Sirius wheezed. Archie hugged his father hard and swallowed back his tears. You won't, Dad. I promise. I swear it. He brushed his father's hair back from his face and looked straight into his eyes. I won't let them take me away, Dad. If they find me guilty, we'll flee the country. Even if they put me in Azkaban, I'll escape. No one escapes Azkaban, Sirius whispered shakily. He clung to Archie weakly. I will. I'll use my animagus form and slip right through the bars, Archie said wildly. He would say anything to bring the life back into his father's eyes. I'm not hearing this, James muttered. He took Archie's wand away from him and ran a hand through his hair. Sirius, I'm sorry, but we can't delay much longer. If you require a sedative, I'll. He's fine. Archie shook his father gently by the shoulders. Aren't you, Dad? We're fine, aren't we? I don't want to you worry. I got myself into this, and I can get myself out. He tried to sound more confident than he felt. Sirius was shaking his head back and forth mutely, but he was also breathing normally once more. It's gonna be okay, Dad. I promise. I'll come home to you and Harry and Remus and everyone. You can ground me for a whole month, all right? A year, Sirius muttered. We can talk about it later, Archie said, relieved when that drew a small laugh from his father. When James was certain that Sirius would be able to compose himself, he opened the door. This way, Archie. Archie kept his father's gaze until they left the room. Uncle James took him to a door with a tinted window set into the face. He paused with a hand on the knob and said quietly, be respectful. Listen carefully. Don't elaborate unless pressed and don't let yourself become emotional. Archie nodded, though privately he suspected it was too late for the last bit. James turned him over without a word, and Shacklebolt gestured to the thin, metal chair across from him with an unreadable expression. He sat, and immediately noticed the seat was sloped in such a way to prevent comfort of any kind. Shacklebolt opened a slim, blue folder and began to peruse the papers within. The text was too small for Archie to read, but he could tell it had been penned recently. Some of the ink still shone dully in the torchlight. Shacklebolt reviewed the folder leisurely, at times making a noise of surprise or interest. When he finished the last page, the Earl leaned back in his chair, a much sturdier construction of cushioned wood, and regarded Archie silently. When he could take no more of the quiet, Archie said, aren't you going to ask me questions? Is there anything you'd like to tell me, first? Archie clamped his mouth shut. Uncle James had just told him to listen, not talk. Shacklebolt shrugged his big shoulders. Well, that's all right. Not much to say, is there? The chain of events seems pretty clear. Archie frowned uncertainly. Does it? Shacklebolt folded his hands on the table and looked at Archie frankly. Got in over your head, I'd say. It started off as an easy lark, just a couple of schoolboys switching places, right? You got an American holiday, and this other kid got to attend the most prestigious magical school in the West. I imagine you weren't thinking about it in the terms they are bandying about now, blood theft, capital crimes, and all that. He paused, and peered at Archie curiously. Archie shook his head slowly. He didn't like that characterization of their ruse, exactly, but he tried to repeat Uncle James' advice in his head and not protest. No, of course not. What does a boy know of blood politics? Shacklebolt tapped his long fingers on the desk idly. You just wanted to go your own way. Make a path in this world on your own terms. It's a heady thing, and I suppose it spun out of control at some point. Archie nodded, then caught the sharp glint in Shacklebolt's steady gaze. What exactly is your question? No question, really, Shacklebolt said. His voice was impossibly smooth, too reassuring to make any sense in the situation. I'm just trying to understand what happened. We all want to understand, you see. He hesitated. What was he supposed to say? Be respectful, James had said. I'm sure it's confusing. How can I help clarify matters? Shacklebolt raised his eyebrows. Well, you might want to clarify just how long this charade of yours went on. There is some speculation that you chickened out of the tournament and paid this less privileged boy to brave the dangers in your place, but I don't believe that. Shacklebolt leaned in, a bit conspiratorially. For one, you don't look anything like the boy who competed in the tournament. Since not one of his friends seems to have suspected a switch, I'm thinking you've never been to Hogwarts. That's correct. I never attended Hogwarts, Archie said carefully. 4 years ago, I went to America and let another kid take my place there. Shacklebolt clapped his hands together. That explains it. The boy who participated in the tournament was there at Hogwarts all along. Of course his friends didn't notice anything different. Of course, Archie agreed. But then, it is devilishly odd that your father never noticed this boy wasn't you. Shacklebolt spread his fingers somewhat apologetically. As we've established, you don't really look like him. Archie took a deep breath. Am I allowed to do magic in here? Shacklebolt frowned. Your wand should have been confiscated. I don't need one for this, and it'll make more sense if I show you. The Era palmed his own wand, then gestured cautiously for Archie to proceed. Archie slipped into Rigel's face easily, like an old hat perfectly molded to his head. He tilted his head to different angles, then let the change drop away. Shacklebolt slowly took out a quill and made several notes in the blue folder. That is most enlightening, Mr. Black. Thank you. Archie felt an easing in his chest and tensed against it. Too reassuring, he reminded himself. Shacklebolt smiled with perfect teeth at him. I was worried we might have to charge you with use of a controlled substance, but I see that polyjuice would not have been necessary for you. I suppose only your co-conspirator will have to face that charge. Archie gulped. The Era went on somewhat blithely. That is the case with many of these charges, of course. You'll both have to answer for academic fraud, but with a little plausible deniability, that is where your part in it will end. Rigel alone will face the blowback for blood identity theft, conspiracy to defraud an international competition, 4 years of controlled substance abuse. We knew the risks, Archie snapped. He didn't need to be reminded how much greater Harry's risk had been. He lived with the knowledge every day. Shacklebolt made a noise of understanding. It was premeditated, then. I didn't realize you were both fully aware of the laws regarding the impersonation of pure-blooded wizards by those of inferior birth. Archie winced. I didn't say that. I'm not sure what you're trying to say, then. I just meant, Rigel must have known. It didn't occur to me that blood was something to worry about. He tried to channel the dismissive privilege Shacklebolt had all but accused him of. I wanted to go to school in America, but Dad wouldn't let me. So I found a kid who wanted to go to Hogwarts and we switched. All this other stuff, how could I have known if he was a half-blood? Shacklebolt did not look impressed. Simple logic might suggest that this boy would not have pretended to be you if he could go to Hogwarts as himself. You must have been aware that half-bloods are prohibited from attending the school. I suppose I knew that rule, but it didn't affect me, so I didn't pay it much mind. Archie shrugged. I was selfish. I know that. It's not like I forced Rigel to take my place, though. And since I didn't know he was a half-blood, my only crime was ignorance. And also the academic fraud. Right. I'll admit to that. Shacklebolt sighed. If that's the story you want to stick to, fine, but understand the position we're in, whether you knew it or not. You helped a half-blood pose as a pureblood in an international competition specifically designed to challenge the merits of blood discrimination. If this was just about the schooling, Hogwarts would handle it internally. If he'd made a fool of people less powerful, Rigel might have been able to disappear quietly and move on with his life. Shacklebolt shook his head solemnly. We're far beyond that now, son. Archie put his head in his hands. Rigel didn't even want to participate in that stupid tournament. Riddle near well forced him. Regardless of how it happened, Shacklebolt said smoothly. All that matters now is straightening it out. For that, We need to talk to Rigel. Archie stiffened. I don't know where. Now, no need to say something you'll regret. Here's the thing. Shacklebolt ticked the points off his fingers slowly. This impersonation of yours was nearly perfect. That takes a lot of coordination and planning, doesn't it? Add to that an escape so smooth we still have no idea where this kid went. You, a wealthy scion of a powerful family, dozens of resources at your fingertips. Him, a half-blood with no name and no one to miss him for 4 years. You'll understand if I think it's unlikely you had no hand in his exit strategy. His lips were pressed so tightly together they ached. Shacklebolt tapped the folder, his expression openly sympathetic. Look, I understand this is a lot. Your uncle says you're a good kid. I know you got top grades at that American school. We ran an a priori diagnostic on your wand, 3 dozen spells back, all very advanced light magic. You're a good person, Mr. Black. I don't think you want to be mixed up in this. You made a mistake, and that's okay. Just help us get to the bottom of this. Archie stared at the table, not moving a muscle. It's like you said, Shacklebolt went on in that even, cajoling tone. He knew the risks. He knew he was half-blooded, even if you didn't, and he chose to impersonate you anyway. Maybe he told you a sad story about not being able to afford schooling. And you helped him out. What do you really owe him? We just want the truth, son. No more lies. That's what you want, too, isn't it? When we find him, we can get all this straightened out. It might have worked, if it really had been some kid from the continent. Just some boy he didn't know very well, who'd been a means to an end but not a true friend. But it was Harry. And he would never. His hands shook, but his voice didn't. I'm sorry, sir, but I won't be able to help you. Shacklebolt opened his mouth, but the door to the interrogation room opened with a wrenching creak and a skinny redhead with a sternness beyond his years strode through it. Percy Weasley looked down his nose at a Shacklebolt and said in a disapproving clip, interrogating a minor without his guardian present. I expect better, Kingsley. Shacklebolt waved a hand toward the left side of the room, and a ward Archie hadn't noticed dropped to reveal a broad panel of clear glass. Sirius, James, the minister, and several others stood behind it, evidently having witnessed the entire proceeding. Archie felt both better and worse for it. Weasley. Come to rescue another poor soul from our evil clutches. Shacklebolt tucked the papers back into the folder with leisurely resignation. Percy produced a roll of parchment and passed it to Shacklebolt for his perusal. My services have been secured for the defense of one Archerus Rigel Black. Unless you have evidence of any crimes other than what he has already admitted to, I insist you release him into his family's custody. Shacklebolt hummed. We're only charging him with academic fraud. He'll be happy to pay the fines incurred, Percy said with a sniff. He still has to write a statement. Shacklebolt palmed his own roll of parchment and passed it across the table with a quill. I suggest you include as much as you can, lest we think of any reason to call you back in. I hope you realize none of his answers today will be admissible in court, Percy said sharply. To Archie, he added, they aren't allowed to question you without counsel, as you're underage. Answers. Shacklebolt scratched his bald head with a lazy grin. I didn't ask him any questions. This upstanding citizen provided information to the DMLE out of what I can only assume is a strong sense of civic duty. To a flummoxed Archie, he added, I'm sure a guilty conscience had nothing to do with it. Archie gaped at him. That wasn't right. Shacklebolt had asked him dozens of questions, hadn't he? The Era saluted James through the glass and left the room whistling. Archie's stomach turned over. What had he said? It was already hard to remember. Best write your statement quickly, Percy said quietly. After that, we can go. With a glance toward the viewing window, he added, it's truth parchment, mind. You can't write a lie. His nerves utterly shot, Archie put quill to parchment and did his best to reiterate the truths, and steer clear of the lies. I, Archerus Rigel Black, do hereby affirm the following. That I did knowingly defraud the American Institute of Magic by attending under a false name. That I did knowingly allow another person to defraud Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry by attending in my name. That I did not, at any time, question or inquire into the blood status of the person who impersonated me at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. That I did not encourage my impostor to participate in the Triwizard Tournament. That I did not help my impersonator escape Scotland following the tournament's conclusion. That my father, Lord Sirius Black, had no knowledge of this impersonation. That my adopted uncle, Lord James Potter, had no knowledge of this impersonation. That I did not intend international embarrassment of the British magical community. That I am sorry for all most of the trouble this plot has caused. Apart from the burning away of one word in the final line, the statement held up against the runes designed to detect intentional falsehoods. Sirius met him at the door. James took his statement, but it was snatched up by the minister at once. What is the meaning of this? You haven't affirmed you don't know who Rigel Black is. Who is he? You do not have to answer, Percy said firmly. Archie met the minister's eyes with tired resignation. Rigel Black could be anyone, Minister. That's kind of the point. Fudge gaped at him. Just what is that supposed to mean? Sirius squeezed his shoulder, but Archie couldn't bite his tongue any longer. A no-name half-blood just won an international tournament in Britain's name. The question is not who is Rigel Black but rather, how many more Rigel Blacks are we missing out on? That's quite enough, James said sharply. Please excuse us, Minister. It's been a long day for everyone. Very long. Fudge muttered. Positively lingering. Go home, then, and this time try to actually get some rest. Tell Moody I want a status report on the whereabouts of that Dark Voldemort fellow by tomorrow morning. I'll tell him. And don't speak to the Prophet about this without me. No one in this office will engage the press. Good. The minister bustled out toward the lifts, and James ushered the rest of them into his personal office. Sirius enveloped Archie in a firm hug when the door was closed. You did good, kid. Shacklebolt tricked me, Archie mumbled into Sirius' robes. That's his job, James said. He didn't sound apologetic at all. Percy, thank you for coming so quickly. I dropped everything when I got your message, Percy said quietly. I'm only sorry I didn't get here sooner. Archie half turned from Sirius' hold to say, you know I'm not Rigel, right? I've been fully briefed on the situation. But why would you want to help? You don't know me, Archie said, letting his confusion show. Percy adjusted his glasses fastidiously. Helping you is the only way I can help him right now. You aren't mad at him, or anything? Archie asked. Rigel is a good person. Anyone who really knows him can't forget that. Percy's eyes grew distant as he added, he always went out of his way to help people he didn't have to. I can do at least as much. Well, thank you. Dad, we can cover his rate or something, right? Percy cleared his throat sharply. I won't hear of it. What Rigel has done will echo in the chambers of history. That I am even a small voice on the side of righteousness is his doing. Raising it in his favor is hardly a sacrifice. I only hope he is safe, and that he will remain so. Archie grimaced guiltily, but Percy held up a hand. No, don't tell me. I cannot be party to any criminal activity. Nor can I, James grumbled. Archie bit his lip and thought carefully before saying, I have no way to know for certain, but I would bet that Rigel is just fine, wherever he is. Percy smiled approvingly. That's nice to imagine. He pulled a stack of papers from his briefcase and handed them to Sirius. These are all the precedents I pulled for his defense. If he gets called in again or formally arrested, please flew me postast. We will. Sirius clasped hands with the young redhead gratefully. My best to your father. And our best to your family in these difficult times. At the office door, Percy paused and said, Fred and George would like Rigel to know that it's the most brilliant prank they've ever heard of. They seed the prank war indefinitely. I suppose, wherever he is, Rigel would just be gratified to have retained their friendship. A Weasley's friendship is not easily lost. Percy left, and it was just the three of them once more. James took a long breath, then said, I will finish the paperwork. Archie is officially being treated as a source, not a suspect, in the Rigel Black case, and the separate charges against him for academic fraud will be settled when the fines are paid. You'll receive an official bill from the court sometime this week. Sirius nodded. James, I can't thank you enough. James waved him off. Those words don't pass between us, Sirius. Archie's like my own son, you know that. I'm just relieved he and Harry are safe. As far as I'm concerned, we can conduct the rest of the investigation without them. So, we can go home, now? Archie asked tentatively. James fixed him with a hard stare. Are you going to pick up paperwork from the Animagus registration office on the way out? That is exactly what we were planning to do, Sirius said bracingly. Better get 2 sets, Archie muttered. James rubbed his temple, opened the door to his office, and barked, Weber. Yes, sir. Coffee. He held the door open and favored Sirius with a flat look. Get your son home before I strangle him, Sirius. His father's hand on his collar marched him out of the error pit without argument. After a short detour at the improper use of magic office, they were able to sneak out the flue closest to the lifts before the crowd of milling reporters spotted their exit. Archie stumbled back into the Potter's receiving room with his clothes and wand clutched tightly in his arms. He could hear Harry talking loudly in the other room, arguing with Remus and Lily, who seemed to be firing questions in rapid succession. Archie rubbed his eyes tiredly, but manfully made his way to the living room to back her up. Depends on whether it was vanished into a temporary spatial pocket or true non-being, Harry was saying. She sounded more than a mite annoyed. And how can it be summoned back from true non-being? Remus demanded. Harry scowled. That's impossible, and you know it. All right, well, how does that square with the third law of recombobulation? Lily asked sharply. Addie cooed uneasily up at her mother, but the red-headed witch was laser-focused on Harry's response. Mum, I know that's NEWT level. Aren't you satisfied yet? Lily and Remus exchanged disgruntled looks, and Archie gaped at them. All the while he was being grilled on the exact details of the blood identity theft, Harry was being questioned on her academics. I just can't believe you learned all of that on your own, Lily grumbled. You didn't have any tutors. I had all the correspondence course instructors, Harry said reprovingly. I never realized you two were such private school snobs. Snobs. Remus visibly balked at the descriptor. Just because we know the value of a traditional education. You assume the value of such an education can't be duplicated, Harry argued. I don't know what you gain from arguing the substitutable nature of such old-fashioned institutions, anyway. That's not. Sirius interrupted Lily. Are you really still on about Harry's schooling? She's clearly no worse off for it. Probably gained some street smarts, too. Easy for you to say, Sirius. Your child still had the benefit of a well-rounded education in all this. But not the benefit of a conferred degree, Archie put in glumly. I'm going to have to take all those classes over again in my own name. You can test out of them, I bet, Harry offered. Sirius turned to Archie slowly, a somewhat disbelieving look in his eyes. We just averted a bloody prison sentence and your only concern is going back to that school. Archie felt his temper flare. I did all this in the first place to go to that school, Dad. It matters to me. Clearly. It mattered more than being honest for 4 years, didn't it? Mattered more than your cousin getting her education. Now hold on, you just said. It must have mattered more than our relationship ever did, as you threw every ounce of my trust and goodwill away without a second thought, didn't you? His father's words slapped across his already bruised conscience and left their mark unerringly. Archie's gaze fell to the floor, and he saw Harry's feet come to stand between them. I think you should get some rest, Uncle Sirius. And I think you've stood between my son and me long enough, Harriet Potter. Don't speak to her that way. Someone has to get it through their thick skulls, Lily. Sirius magic flared and the lights flickered. Addie began to cry. I'm relieved to have them safe, Godric knows I am. But what they've done has changed everything. There are things that cannot be undone. Someone has to make them understand. We do understand, Harry said firmly. Archie didn't know how she could speak at all, his tongue felt like lead in his mouth. Oh, you understand. The sarcasm in Sirius' voice was sharp. You understand that this country is on the verge of a blood war. You understand that there is discriminatory legislation being voted on in less than a month, and that this throws a giant, stinking dung bomb into the middle of hundreds of people's political machinations. Years of planning and compromise to bring a coalition of people together to defeat this bill. You understand that, Harry? Harry stood her ground. Ignoring how hypocritical it is for you to lecture anyone about disrupting society's political calculations, Uncle Sirius, yes, we do understand that. None of us wanted Rigel to be found out, maintaining that neither Archie nor I knew he was even half-blooded, but on top of that, it's entirely because of this legislation that Rigel was in that drat tournament in the first place. Don't you think it was unwise, for a boy with so many secrets to participate in something so high-profile and ridiculous? I thought it was unwise for Archie to do it, much less a half-blood masquerading as him, Remus mused. Exactly. Archie looked up to see his cousin's face lit with indignant stubbornness as she went on. Rigel didn't want to. Riddle blackmailed him into it, first by threatening our family, who Rigel has no reason to protect, by the way, and then using the possibility of victory as a political bargaining chip. Lily turned white and Remus sat down abruptly in the nearest armchair. That boy got Riddle to agree to an unbreakable vow, Sirius. Because Rigel won the tournament, Riddle can never back a piece of discriminatory blood legislation related to employment, healthcare, or marriage ever again. Sirius froze. What, Riddle would never agree to that? He wanted Rigel to participate that badly, Harry said, her voice growing gentler as her words started to sink in. And he thought Rigel winning would prove the point of pure blood supremacy anyway, and that he wouldn't need any more legislation after the marriage law. But now, don't you see? Rigel has upset the light's political calculus, sure, but he's upset the dark's even more. A half-blood won the Triwizard tournament. Riddle is bound and his point will go unproven. Disproven, if anything, Archie added. Part of him realized he had yet to feel properly proud of Harry for that. She had won the Triwizard tournament. If we beat this bill, it's the last, Lily said quietly. Wonderingly. The last backed by Riddle, Remus corrected her shrewdly. His party can still introduce legislation. But they are hamstrung without his explicit support, Lily said, a smile beginning to form on her lips. Sirius, sit down. Let's think about this. We must speak with Dumbledore, Augusta, and, I'm not even sure who will believe it. Sirius shook his head, clenching his fists helplessly. That's not, it doesn't excuse. Just say why you're really angry, Uncle Sirius, Harry challenged. Archie stepped around Harry to take his father's hand. Dad, I know it doesn't change that we lied to you. I will spend the rest of my life making that up to you. Lying to you was the hardest part of it, and I am more sorry than I can say with words alone. I know Harry is, too. I am, Harry said impatiently. But the guilt I feel doesn't mean we can ignore the wider consequences of our actions, including the potentially beneficial ones, Harry added, somewhat unhelpfully. We're the ones who will be affected by this law if it passes. And we're the ones who just gave the light its best chance at beating it. You can be mad at us forever, but the chance to beat Riddle is here now. She's right. Remus shook his head slowly as Sirius glared at him. I know, Sirius, but, she's right. I was only thinking about Archie and the trouble he was in, but a half-blood did win the Triwizard tournament. Not only that, he destroyed the competition. If we get behind this quick enough. I can't hear this right now. Sirius pulled away from Archie, turned his back on the rest of them, and ran his hands through his hair. He looked like a man at the end of his rope. I'm going to. The flu alarm went off, and they froze. That can't be James, Lily said, standing with a frown. I'll get it, Remus said quickly, urging Lily to stay with Addie on the sofa. Might be some nosy reporter. Oh, Merlin, we'll be inundated, Lily muttered bleakly. Remus was only gone a few moments, and when he came back, his face was carefully blank. Sirius. His friend looked over with a drawn expression. It's for you. Regulus Black strode into the room on a storm cloud, looking very much like a man who had slept in his robes. Where is he, brother? Sirius groaned aloud. I do not have the patience today, Reggie. Regulus grabbed a handful of his older brother's robes and shook Sirius bodily. Where is the imposter? Where's the little mongrel that dragged our line through the mud in front of the entire truth, you rabid asshole? Sirius shook Regulus loose with a growl. You think I'm harboring him, do you? Do not pretend you didn't know, Regulus shot back. You can fool the rest of the world, but I know how close you two are. There's no way you were fooled. Sirius went green, and his hands began to shake. Uncle Regulus, that's quite enough, Archie said quickly. I assure you, my father had no idea, and you making him feel worse about it is not helpful. Regulus turned to scowl at him, then did a double take. Am I to understand that you are my actual nephew? As though my identity matters to you beyond a set of chromosomes. Archie shook his head. Whatever your intentions in coming here, we have enough on our plates today. And whose fault is that? Regulus sneered. Mine. Mine, Harry said at the same time. Regulus turned to glower at her. I'm not at all surprised to find you involved, Miss Potter, if I may presume your identity despite a rather desperate shift in outward appearance. I beg your pardon. It's fine, Mum. Mr. Black also won't be surprised to know that it was my idea, Harry said baldly. On the contrary, it confirms my worst suspicions of your influence on my nephew. Which nephew? The one you just met, or the one you thought was your nephew that you were so very proud of until you found out he was a half-blood? Harry's eyes were alight with something Archie had never seen in her before. It was like seeing a light bulb without a lampshade for the first time. There was something unapologetically sharp and bright and free in her eyes, and he wondered if that flame had always been there or if the events of the last 24 hours had ignited it. Do you think it funny, to fool so many people with your little game? Do you think it amusing to watch people pin their hopes to a false idol and see their plans in ruins at your feet? Regulus leaned down to menace over Harry, and Lily got to her feet. Be quiet, Regulus. This is my house, and I won't have you. I wouldn't be here if my brother were ever at home. Barging in to berate my daughter for your own disappointments. Lily took a deep breath. Misplaced disappointments at that, Harry added acerbically. Archie is a better heir than Rigel would ever have been, and it's not because of his perfect pedigree. Archie wished Harry hadn't found her voice in defending him, as he didn't feel he needed it. Whether or not his uncle liked him really wasn't a hill worth taking, and earning his ire wasn't something Harry needed when she was supposed to be lying low. Regulus dismissed him with a glance. The Black Line will need more than a good heir to come back from this travesty. We look like fools, brother. Incompetent fools. Sirius laughed dryly. That may be my silver lining. Thanks, Reg. This is no joke, Sirius. Lord Riddle is furious. Do you understand? If I survive the next 6 months, it will be down to how useful I can be in finding this boy for him. For the first time, Archie noticed how scared Regulus was, under the veneer of fury. You'll never find him, Harry said softly. And I'm not going to let you trade Riddle that kid to save your own skin, Sirius spat, disgust in his tone. Maybe stop serving the psychopath, did you think of that? Regulus bared his teeth. Riddle has marked him, Sirius. It is only a matter of time before he tracks him down. The kid is doomed either way, but if we get to him first, Riddle may be merciful. Sirius took Regulus by the arm and searched his face with a hard stare. You really believe Riddle will forgive you for not noticing? No, Reggie. He might pretend to, but your days in the Son of the Sow party are done. You should cut and run. A black doesn't turn his back on his principles. Oh, what principles? Sirius made an impatient noise. Is your priority this family or your pride? Regulus shrugged off his brother's hand with a sneer. Rich, coming from you. I'm on a hypocritical roll today, apparently. Remus spoke up tentatively, bravely ignoring Regulus' hostile expression as he asked, are you in earnest fear for your life, Regulus? We can protect you. You. Or Dumbledore. I would rather be cursed in the back. Regulus tossed his head like an offended stallion. I will find some other way to get back in Lord Riddle's good graces. His bare tolerance, you mean, Harry said. Riddle has no good graces. You know nothing, you impudent little. I know something that will get you back with intolerance, actually. Regulus froze. His eyes narrowed. You know where the imposter is? Harry set her chin. No. But I know something Riddle doesn't, that will change the way he looks for Rigel. Regulus worked his jaw, clearly torn between believing her and dismissing her. Archie wondered why Harry would offer information to Regulus of all people. She hated him, as far as he knew. I won't even make you ask, Harry said briskly. I don't hate you nearly enough to give Riddle the satisfaction of punishing Rigel through you. Regulus scowled, but held his tongue for once. Harry lowered her voice and said, tell Riddle that his mark is no longer on Rigel Black. And what does that mean? Tell him Voldemort bears it instead. If he tracks it, he'll find Voldemort, not Rigel. Voldemort? The dark wizard who attacked the tournament. What do you know about this madman, Harry? Remus asked, disturbed. I know he's been recruiting thugs from the lower alleys, Harry said. I know he attacked a coven of vampires who live up the street from me. I know he's bad news. And you somehow know he bears the mark Lord Riddle himself believes is carried by Rigel, Regulus said, suspicion warring with accusation. Harry bowed her head. Rigel got a Patronus to me, before he fled. He explained what happened in the final task. Harry, you didn't mention. Dad can't know. Harry looked around at them all very seriously. James cannot know that I have been in contact with Rigel since yesterday. I know you don't believe us, Uncle Remus, when we say we don't know who Rigel is or where he is. Mum, I know you have doubts, too. Neither of you is good at hiding your thoughts. It's fine if you don't believe us. But Dad has to believe us. It's his career on the line if he has suspicions and doesn't turn us in. I should turn you in, Regulus snarled. On hearsay. Harry favored him with an unimpressed look. And cut off your only source of information on the imposter. Regulus looked to Archie, who held up his hands and shook his head. Don't look at me. Harry was the one in England all this time. Whatever Rigel needed, he went to her. This lie was new, and felt unwieldy on his lips. He hadn't practiced it. Harry was going off script. Regulus took a deep breath, set his gaze on Harry's hard face and let it out. If you're lying, girl. Riddle will know the truth in any case when he tracks that bit of magic he tried to shove into Rigel's core. He what? Remus looked sick, and Lily put a hand to Addie's head in reflexive recoil. Archie felt a little ill himself, and he didn't fully understand what Harry even meant. Harry seemed utterly unconcerned. If you tell him first, Rigel loses nothing, and maybe Riddle doesn't kill you. And maybe he comes after you when he hears how I knew this, Regulus suggested darkly. Lily made a noise of distress, but Harry only smiled. That would be a poor look for him. I think he'll have enough bad press as it is. Archie hated how confident Harry sounded, as though she faced down terrible men all the time, and it didn't scare her anymore. He knew the ruse had changed them, had felt it within himself, a callous at the center of his soul, but he hadn't realized how much it had affected Harry, on a level so deep that only now, when the first few layers of illusion had violently ruptured, was a hint of it beginning to shine through. Take your information and try to repair your tattered reputation, ready. Sirius said it tiredly, but his face was firm. You won't mention Harry if you know what's good for you. Then how will I explain? You'll explain that the Black family head will disown you if you reveal your source. How much use do you think he'd find you if you had no last name at all, brother? Regulus blanched, and backed away from Sirius. With a last glare at all of them, he strode from the room. The flare of the flue broke the silence that fell in the living room, but only briefly. We should all get some rest, Archie suggested weakly. Sirius nodded, all his fight having left the room with his younger brother. Remus shuffled slowly toward the door, but Lily waylaid him. Will you take Addie for me tonight? Addie held out her arms for Remus with happy yammerings of agreement. Remus took her gently, though he looked uncertain. Would you rather me stay here to help? No, thank you. My daughter and I are going to have a talk. Harry winced, but didn't argue. Archie wished he could help, but they couldn't protect one another from everything. Anyway, he had his own parental quagmire to wade through and Harry had no one to blame but herself. Helping Regulus made no sense, except, Harry always went out of her way to help people, even when she didn't have to. And that was kind of the point, wasn't it? -0. HP. -0. The first time she tried to use the flu, it didn't work. The second time, it stung her. Shaking her smarting fingers, Harry ducked into the kitchen where Lily was feeding Addie for what must have been the 20th time that morning. "Mum, the flu." "Talk to your father." "Right." James was holed up in his study, and had been for several weeks. Harry had been avoiding him mostly, aware that his quality of life had significantly worsened since the debacle of the last task and the accompanying fallout. Owls hounded their breakfast table until he adjusted the wards, and now they crowded the front step agitatedly until James got around to collecting or burning their cargo. She'd seen snapshots in the paper of James hassled repeatedly in the ministry lobby, and finally Amelia Bones had directed James to work from home. Harry suspected he'd rather be hassled by reporters than attempt to work down the hole from a demanding toddler. She knocked at the door and took the ensuing grunt for permission to enter. James was surrounded by stacks of newspapers, letters, and blue government folders. He nudged an empty mug her way without looking up from a statement he was taking notes on. "Could use another cuppa, darling." "I'll get you one, Dad." Harry reached out for the mug, but James put a hand on it quickly. "Harry." "What is it?" Harry tensed the muscles in her leg against the impulse to shift her weight uncomfortably. "I just came to ask about the flu, actually." "No. I just wanted to go to the apothecary. I'm low on ingredients." "No." Harry swallowed her first and second complaints and tried to see things from his perspective. "I won't talk to any reporters," she said, eyeing the screaming headlines piled on his desk corner. "Hogwarts half-blood still at large. Who is the Rigel black child? SOW bill battered in hailstorm hearing. The end of pure-blood politics as we know it." James set down his quill with an impatient sigh. "It's not about the reporters, Harry. The public is in an uproar. Do you know how many death threats Sirius has received?" She felt her heart shrink several sizes. "No," she said quietly. "Suffice to say there are 24 open cases on malicious harassment for the blacks alone." James fixed her with a serious look. "For every person celebrating Rigel's win as a symbolic deyoking of the oppressive status quo, there is someone the status quo benefits who wants this kid dead. The public knows how close the Potters and the blacks are. It is now common knowledge that the real black heir was gallivanting in America for 4 years in your name. It's not a large leap to assume you were involved in the plot to destabilize the pure-blood hegemony, too." "But there was no plot," Harry protested. "That doesn't matter, Harry." James worked his jaw tiredly. "I just need you to stay in the house right now, all right?" She nodded. "I'll just get you another coffee, Dad." He pushed the mug her way, and it was almost a peace offering. In reaching to take it, her elbow caught the edge of a stack of papers and a mountain slide ensued. The coffee cup was swept off the desk with 24 copies of the Daily Prophet and a tinkling crunch reported its fate. Sorry, Harry muttered, dropping to her knees to stack the papers. "I can't get used to the size of my limbs, and I forgot what not having peripheral vision is like." She shot a simple repairing spell from her fingertips and recovered the mug with a relieved smile. James cleared his throat. "You can't do magic at home like that, Harry. You don't live in the alleys anymore." Harry winced. "Sorry. Remus is devising a revision schedule for me. I'm going to take my O.W.L.S at the end of the summer. Until then, no magic without adult supervision." Harry stood, a stack of papers under one arm and the mug cradled in her hands. "Yes, Dad. Do you need these, or shall I take them?" "Just put them in the basement. I may need them later." She retreated from the study and told herself it wasn't cowardice. Lily took the coffee cup from her when she reached the kitchen. "I'll handle it, Harry. Maybe you should go study some more." Studying was all she and Archie were allowed to do, at least until Remus was satisfied he had mapped the edges of their education. No amount of reassurance that they were both well ahead of the standard British syllabus would do. Lily and Remus had to see it proven. She carried the stack of newspapers down to her lab and arranged them chronologically. Part of her didn't want to know, but it wouldn't do to live in ignorance while the rest of the world went on. The accounts immediately following the final task were the most damning. Public opinion oscillated wildly between confusion, fear, and outrage. Voldemort was mentioned, misspelled and misquoted, dozens of times. Speculation was quick to tie him to the terrorist activities at the World Cup and violent extremist events over the last year. After that, predictions devolved into a predictable pattern of vampire demonization and dark wizard accusations leveled like political spears at the SOW party. Curiosity and a sense of delectitious scandal seemed to permeate writing about Rigel Black, at least for the first several issues. She could feel the relish oozing from Skeeter's pen in a particularly damning essay aimed at the political elite on both sides. One has to wonder at it, readers. How could two such celebrated geniuses both be so wildly misled by a child's play acting? Albus Dumbledore harbored RBC amidst the children of our pureblood elite for 4 years, and sources say the boy was Lord Riddle's own pick for a pureblood spot in what was supposed to be a rigorously vetted international tournament. With a wolf so long languishing among their sheep, are these the shepherds we should trust to lead us at all? Harry shuffled through the next several issues, looking for a shift in the public conversation toward the upcoming legislation vote. There. An interview with Dumbledore himself. Q. Thank you for sitting down with us today, Headmaster. I know this is a busy time of year for you. More for my students, as you likely recall, Miss Orinthia, this reporter must confess she does not remember the Hogwarts end-of-term examinations fondly. Q. Of course. So things are proceeding as normal at the school. As normal as possible, considering all that has happened. Understandably, the students have a number of questions about their former classmate. Alas, they may never receive complete answers. Q. Rigel Black was well liked, wasn't he? Phenomenally so. You must remember, this is a boy who saved many of his classmates from the evil sleeping sickness his first year here. Q. That's right, and he defeated a basilisk that was terrorizing the school his second year, didn't he? Quite a legacy he leaves behind. It almost makes you wonder what his next 3 years would have been like, had he continued at Hogwarts. I will wonder that for the rest of my life. Q. People are also wondering, and I have to ask, you really had no idea? Forgive me, but the general consensus when I went to school was that you knew everything, Headmaster. And not everyone will know this, but I have a close relationship with Lord Sirius Black. I met his son several times when he was very small, but a child can change significantly in the first 11 years of his life. Many exhibit radical shifts in identity during their youth, and the boarding school environment actually encourages children to discover themselves independently of the expectations of their families and friends back home. Q. So you chalked up any discrepancies to the boy being a teenager, essentially. The simplest explanation is usually the best. In this exceptional case, the explanation was much more complicated than anyone could have possibly imagined. A boy of 11, do you remember yourself at 11? Q. By Merlin, I could barely find my way to Charms class. A boy of those tender years assumed not only a new name, but a prominent title and an entire chessboard of expectations to navigate from the very start. Looking back, I marvel at it. He came here with none of the preparation our pure-blooded students receive. None of the private tutors or ancient stockpiles of knowledge. Yet, he was top of his year. He achieved things not seen in half a century at this school. Q. He won an international tournament, pitted against the best students in the world. Yes, I know what you mean. It is incredible, and, you know, it really makes you think. Hogwarts must be one heck of a school. I would like to take total credit, but I suspect there was just something extraordinary about the boy we know as Rigel Black. Harry had to put the paper down as the words began to blur. She wiped at her eyes and called herself an idiot several times over. Her glasses were smudged by the tears and she removed them with a huff of annoyance. She hated wearing glasses again. At times it made her crave the modified polyjuice potion. She'd gladly look like Archie the rest of her life if it meant she could see. She froze, the embryo of an idea taking root on the side wall of her brain without warning. Scrambling for her notebook, she jotted down 3 words. Partial modified polyjuice. Harry. Come upstairs. Halfway between reality and what could be, she shook herself loose of the idea and jogged up the stairs to answer her mother's call. Archie's here, Lily said when she came into the kitchen. Addie was somehow still eating. Perhaps toddlers were an exception to Gant's law, and there was a hole to non-being in Addie's stomach. Back garden. 30 minutes. Ah yes. Their allotted outdoor time. It was more than prisoners of Azkaban got, she reminded herself wryly. Somehow, draconian policies born of a reflexive need to re-exert control hadn't factored into Harry's calculation of this particular scenario. It was hard to feel indignant, though. She could see every time her parents looked at her how deep the ruse had cut. How confused they were. How betrayed they felt. Sometimes her mother stared at her as though she'd never seen her before. Eventually, they would get used to Harry and Archie's new appearances. Eventually, the wounds of trust would have to heal. Archie looked up from where he was kicking at a plot of grass and summoned a smile for her. They started walking the perimeter of the lawn automatically, Harry walking a bit faster to keep up with Archie's significantly longer stride. "How's he been?" Harry asked. "Better. He stopped all his volunteer work, so he's been a bit restless. It's not good for him to be cooped up, but I've been helping him redecorate the house." I told him we could get rid of the snakes," Archie said, a slightly hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. "I think he likes them, though." Snakes. Tree slider. Harry's heart clenched, and she hoped the boomslang had found his way to the kitchens without her. She supposed there were plenty of mice in Hogwarts, but she did miss having the snake around. "How are your parents?" "Kind of distant," she admitted. "Lily especially. She doesn't like keeping a secret from James, but she can't tell him that I knew before he found me that Rigel had fled. It feels like I'm constantly trying not to freak them out. Like I forgot how to be normal at some point. They're probably just a lot more observant right now. We really shocked them. We really shocked everyone. Have you seen the papers?" Archie shook his head with a grimace. "I couldn't bear to. Dad either. I think our mail's just piling up somewhere." "Did you write Hermione?" "Yeah." Archie blew out a long breath. "Nothing from her yet. Hell, I don't know if she'll ever want to speak to me again." "If she's that mad, she'll want to tell you," Harry said wryly. Archie chuckled weakly. "Yeah. It's her dismissal I'm really afraid of. I'm trying to figure out how to get those items back from Rigel," Harry said carefully. She wouldn't put it entirely past her parents to have eavesdropping wards on them, though she didn't feel any when she bathed the garden with her magic. "Maybe he can mail them back to us." "The mirror, you mean? And the locket?" Lily's gotten a lot of questions about it, and having the original would help her assess its effectiveness. "A lot of job offers, too, I bet. The Department of Mysteries wants to canonize her, I think." Archie sent her a sidelong look that was studiously neutral. "Is it true the necklace stopped a killing curse?" Harry nodded, her mood darkening. She'd been so stupid that night. So desperate to get free that she left herself wide open to a lethal attack. She shouldn't have survived, wouldn't have, without that locket. It was like a really powerful ward anchored to the wearer. The killing curse isn't blockable by any magic an individual can summon at a moment's disposal, but it can't penetrate everything. It can be physically stopped, and wards that are anchored firmly enough and woven tightly enough will stop it, too. Lily put weeks of magic into a single moment, ready to be unleashed at the right trigger. The cleverest bit was how she set the triggering mechanisms. It didn't activate any of the dozens of times Rigel was cursed or attacked. Only when he would have otherwise died. Ruddy brilliant. She could outfit the whole Auror division, and dark wizards wouldn't stand a chance, Archie said, admiring. "It would be hard to scale up significantly without a lot more help," Harry said, mentally calculating the amount of power even one dark detection disc would require. What could be more worth throwing magic at than saving lives? Archie looked up at the sky and grimaced. "That was naive, huh? I'm working on that." "Don't." Harry nudged him with her shoulder. "I like that you see the best in the world." "Do I? Or do I imagine a world that doesn't exist?" He looked down at her glumly. "Lately, I've been wondering if anything I think about the world is real." "There are good and bad things in this world," Harry said firmly. "There are evil psychopaths who want to crush other people beneath their boots, and then there are really nice pairs of boots, with fireproofing and acid-resistant soles and stretchy leather that's soft on the ankles. I get it, Harry, you miss your boots. Archie laughed, and this time it was stronger. Little does the world appreciate the true casualty of our double life. It's all about perspective, she agreed. When Archie smiled, her own heart felt a little lighter. Speaking of perspective, would you be offended if I kept your eyesight after all? You've lost me, Harry. I was just thinking I actually missed the polyjuice a little. I miss being tall, and I really, really miss good vision. Then I thought, what if there was a way to select the exact attributes that polyjuice imitates? Isolate the genes expressed to one specific desirable trait, instead of clumsily copying the whole strand of genetic material. You want to steal my eyes. I want to steal your eyesight. You can keep the color. Archie shot her an offended look. Grey goes with everything. It's a black color. I'd like to try being a Potter for a while, if it's all the same to you. Your loss, Archie said. For a moment, it was like they were kids again. Arch. The back door opened and Sirius came jogging out, holding a smoking red letter in his hand. You'd better take this, sport. Archie eyed it with alarm. You didn't vanish it like the others. This one's from your friend. Harry pressed her lips together but couldn't contain a snort. Something funny, Harry. Hermione sent you a howler. Harry burst into laughter. Sorry. Ha ha, sorry. Can I listen? You may not have a choice. Sirius thrust it into Archie's hands hurriedly. It's gonna blow. No, I'm not ready for. The howler burst open at Archie's touch and zoomed into the air before him, red paper twisting to form a very displeased moo as it shouted. Didn't I tell you to include me in your stupid plots? All this time I could have helped you. Sirius choked and Harry had to smother her amusement once more as Archie stared in wondering confusion at the shrieking missive. If I didn't think it entirely beyond you, I'd accuse you of slumming it with the gullible Muggleborn and taking a spot held open for lesser-blooded students at AIM in the same breath. Archie blanched. But I know you. Everything makes more sense now, not less. Do you know how often I questioned my own sanity? How I dismissed my own confusion when what I observed and what I knew didn't add up? Don't you ever make me question myself again, you selfish, stupid boy, if that is your preferred gender. Harry muffled an unkind guffaw at the way Archie's face slid from guilt to shame to hope again. When your most deserved grounding comes to an end, I expect you to grovel profusely and apologize to my parents. They are quite concerned that my best friend has been lying to me for 4 years. Then you are going to explain which one of you I was running around the lower alleys with all summer and just how you intend to continue your studies with your first 4 years of marks utterly voided. The letter paused, as though to catch its breath, then said, in a much softer but still somewhat shouting tone, I do hope nothing bad has befallen Rigel. I have thoughts regarding his methods, but he is a hero of human rights and a person of relatively sound moral fiber from all I have witnessed. Please write back. Hermione. The howler shredded itself and collapsed in a heap of smoking paper on the lawn. Sirius put it out with his wand and didn't bother to hide the wide smirk on his face. You sure know how to pick 'em, Archie. I don't deserve her friendship. Don't flatter yourself, Cousin Harry teased. Just be grateful Hermione is a merciful god. Sirius barked a laugh, and Archie looked immediately more at ease. He blinked the moisture back from his eyes and said, You're just jealous. I bet none of your friends have sent you a howler. Harry stiffened. Forcing a huff, she said, My brewer is probably drafting one as we speak. It's been weeks since I delivered any orders to him. Archie grimaced apologetically when Sirius bent to make sure the howler was no longer a fire hazard. Harry shrugged uncomfortably. She knew he didn't mean the joke to sting. Certainly, she wouldn't be receiving any letters at all from her former friends, though they might wish to send Rigel a howler. She and Archie had decoupled the mail spells from their aliases entirely. Only letters addressed to Harriet Potter would reach her now, regardless of what address was used. Letters to Rigel Black would get turned around entirely, as Sirius had explicitly blocked the alias after the first dozen letters descended on Grimmauld Place. Lily called them in for dinner, and Harry busied herself setting the table. She couldn't afford to wonder which of her friends might have tried to reach out. Probably, they were as angry and confused as everyone else. Draco, she tried not to think about what she'd done to him, but sometimes she woke up in a cold sweat, the weight on his devastated stare between her shoulder blades, unshruggable. Rumors came into the kitchen with James in tow, evidently having pried him from his case files. "Smells delicious, Lily. Sirius cooked tonight. He brought it over to escape the construction dust, I gather." Sirius nodded emphatically. "The kitchen's a war zone, but the oven still functions." "No dessert?" James asked, opening a covered container with a curious sniff. "No cake for a month." Sirius sent Archie a stern look that even Harry could tell was mostly for James' benefit. Archie rolled his eyes. "You could make a cake and not give me any, Dad. This way, we're all suffering." Sirius pouted and Remus laughed. "Sirius knows he would cave the first time you eyed it longingly." James and Lily did not laugh, and an awkwardness descended as they all took their seats. Harry had expected Sirius to take the ruse hardest, he depended so much on Archie, and their bond was already strained, but after an initial stormy period of extreme highs and lows, Sirius seemed to have embraced his parental relationship with Archie with new vigor. He gained visible satisfaction from imposing arbitrary and sometimes ridiculous rules and watching Archie follow them. Her cousin had reportedly gone an entire day without using any form of the verb to be just to humor Sirius. She supposed after the shock of the lie settled, Sirius was just glad to have an explanation for his son's erratic and distant behavior all these years. Harry's parents, who had no reason whatsoever to worry about her previously, felt the betrayal all the keener. James had the added stress of heading a politically charged investigation he knew she was at least tangentially involved in, and Lily. Harry suspected she was using concern over Harry's evident lack of formal education to cover a deeper anxiety about the world her daughter inhabited and the measures she had taken to secure a place there. Lily had explicitly begged her to never contact Rigel Black again. She'd all but wept when she explained in wrenching detail exactly what would happen to Harry were she discovered to be any more central to the blood identity crime. Archie's assertion of guilt was the only thing between her and much harsher public scrutiny. The power of Archie's word, vested in the purity of his blood and social status, had saved her, even as their crime threatened to sweep the legs out from under that very power. Lily was terrified for her, and that, Harry thought, translated mostly to a defensive chill. Out of nowhere, Sirius asked, "That one time when you went to the Weasleys, was that you or Rigel?" Archie swallowed a mouthful of carrots. "Me. It was too hard to switch then, so I just pretended to be him for a day." "You pretended to be yourself," Sirius repeated thoughtfully. "I pretended to be the kid the Weasleys knew from school," Archie clarified. "Whenever we picked you up from school." "That was Rigel," Archie said quietly. "He'd go home with you. I'd go home with the Potters. Sometime the next day, usually, he would flew here, Harry would flew back from Diagon Alley, and we'd all swap." James stabbed a red potato with unnecessary force. Remus gestured with his water glass in Harry's direction. "That wasn't you at the Yule Ball." "Definitely not." Harry made a disgusted face. "Archie took some serious artistic liberties that night. I'm not an expert on girls' fashion." "That explains so much," Sirius said. "Horrifying," James agreed with a surly grunt. "At the Malfoys' summer parties?" Remus asked. "Rigel. We swapped the day of or before." "I've never been to the Malfoys' place," Archie admitted. Sirius gaped at him. "I went to all those stuffy parties for nothing." "What about the New Year's Eve galas?" Archie pretended to think about it. "Sometimes me. Sometimes Rigel." "Harry, were you me once?" "I don't remember," she lied. "We switched so many times, we had a lot of notes." "Burned them," she added as James looked up from his plate inquiringly. "Right," he muttered. "I suppose we know why you never brought Hermione over," Lily said quietly. "Because I don't know her at all," yes, Harry said dryly. "Also, she thought I was a girl who identified and presented as a boy." "That's involved," Remus said diplomatically. "Yeah." Archie paused between bites of potatoes and said seriously. "Also, I'm in love with her." "She just sent you a howler," Sirius reminded him. "Dear Merlin, it's Lily and James all over again." Remus chuckled. "When she hexes you, you'll know it's forever." Even James and Lily had to smile at that. Something soft passed between them, and it gave Harry hope that everything could be salvaged after all. A squawk like a dying rooster came from the back door and Addie shrieked back like a werewolf responding to the call of its own kind. What the devil now? James threw his napkin down and stalked to the door. Bloody owl's got no respect for the morning part of Morning Post. He cracked the door enough to allow the owl to deposit its burden at his feet with another ugly screech. James flipped it a nut and frowned as he collected the missive. It was a newspaper, but only looked to be a couple of pages thick. Special edition, he murmured, slicing through the ties with a table knife. Harry could read the headline from across the table. Forever do we part, marriage law meets defeat. Lily dropped her fork with a clatter and Sirius jumped to his feet. We did it. We did it. Sirius pulled Addie out of her high chair and spun her around the room with a shout of jubilation. Addie vomited all over his robes. Sirius held her at arm's length and laughed. He laughed until he began to shake and Lily swiftly rescued her youngest daughter from her human roller coaster of an uncle. The vote wasn't even close, James said wonderingly. His eyes flew across the page. Resoundingly rejected by a clear margin, it says. A final reckoning for a party plagued with publicity problems who provoked a populist backlash by proving before one and all the puerile pretension on their own platform. By Godric, that's nice to read. Skeeter does have a way with alliteration, Harry said. Her cheeks hurt with how hard she wanted to grin. Lily rounded the table and James embraced her with a laugh that was half cry. Harry caught Archie's eye, and for the first time in a long time, something like pride bloomed quietly between them. Well done, Remus said quietly. Harry looked over and caught the full weight of his approval. You pushed us to capitalize on Rigel's story. It worked, Harry. You all made it happen, she said, shrugging slightly. I was stuck here. Rigel was like a penalty shot. He gave you the chance, but in the end, the same people who worked all these years to combat systematic discrimination made the final play. So well done you. Well done all of us, Sirius said loudly. James, I'm breaking into your wine cellar. We don't have a cellar. I'm diving into the back of that cabinet you think we don't know about in your study. Sirius made a break for the door, and James darted after him. Now, wait just a second. Some of those were inherited. Archie put his hand on Harry's and said, comically solemn, I'm afraid I'm going to have to break our engagement, Miss Potter. Harry put a hand to heart and fluttered her lashes in distress. Be honest, is there someone else? He squeezed her hand tightly. I've found my perfect person, it's true, but more than that, I simply don't think you require my protection any longer. Let's tear up the contract, then. I was thinking we'd burn it. Can I keep the cauldrons in the divorce? We both know I wouldn't care for them properly. Remus laughed. This can only be for the good of the universe. You've certainly proven how dangerous the two of you are together, Lily said on a sigh. She came to lay a soft hand on Harry's curls. Remus is right, though. While the rest of us were fumbling, you pushed through the fog with startling clarity. This is your victory, too. The magical world will be a better place for all witches and wizards tomorrow. Technically, it will be exactly the same, Archie said slowly. It just won't have gotten worse. The SOW party still exists. The absence of the threat of arbitrary discrimination is what makes the world free, Archie. Lily smiled down at Addie with perfect hope. The existence of that party itself is not the problem. The problem is the concentration of power in the hands of those who would use it to arbitrarily constrain the autonomy of others. Such a concentration of arbitrary power will always be a stain on the tapestry of a tolerant and open society, but today that power was blunted. The discriminatory views of those people no longer matter, because they cannot wield power over us anymore. The next step is dismantling the damage they've already done, Remus added. The legislation that prevents Hogwarts from schooling children based on blood has to be our target. Access to education in the absence of other discriminatory legislation means access to jobs, security, and happiness. Lily and Remus devolved into a side panel on the logical next avenues of political action, but Harry had trouble focusing. She was still a little shell-shocked. How much time had she spent agonizing over the problem of the marriage law? Especially in the last year, it had come to feel like a problem that was entirely her own. If it passed, it was her fault for winning the tournament as a pureblood. If it failed, it would be because of something she did or said to turn the tide of public sentiment. Well, the tide was turned, but not from anything she could have predicted or wanted. What she said to Remus was the truth. In the end, it had almost nothing to do with her. People all over, who she didn't know and would probably never meet, had made their own voices heard. The status quo would change. The world would adjust in fits and starts to the new balance of power, even though most would never know that the stuttering collapse of SOW momentum hinged on an unbreakable vow between one man and one child. Harry would have to adjust, too. It wasn't just the breaking of the engagement contract with Archie. Unlike her cousin, she had no school to go back to in the fall. She had no friends to keep in touch with. All she'd done as Rigel was nothing, now. She would have to make her own way at last. -0. PPPPPP. -0. Narcissa met her at the grate, a look in her eye that told her things were worse than she suspected. Pansy, thank you for coming. I would have come sooner, but Draco's been ignoring my letters, Pansy said quietly. How is he? Narcissa removed the ashes from Pansy's robes without looking her in the eye. He's shaken. Angry, but only on the surface. Pansy didn't have to ask what was beneath that surface, it would be the same churning mass of questions that found purchase in her own chest. Along with a good dose of self-recrimination, knowing Draco. A crash like glass shattering against stone startled from some distance and Narcissa pursed her lips. Excuse me, dear. I must see to my husband. You remember the way? She nodded. Narcissa left at something slightly slower than a jog, and Pansy wondered what Lord Malfoy had to be so upset about. It had been a trying few weeks for everyone, but then, men were so much more fragile about disappointment. Draco's door was closed when she approached it. It required true petulance to close a door in a house as big as Malfoy Manor. She braced herself for a scene. Pansy knocked firmly several times. I'm not hungry, Draco called through the door. Pansy allowed herself an eye roll and pushed the door open regardless. I'm not here to bring you a snack, Draco. Pansy. Draco yelped her name more than said it and scrambled up from where he'd been lying indolently on the bedspread. The curtains in the room were drawn tightly together and her nose caught the musty smell of a boy who had not bathed in days. What are you doing here? I've come to see why you're ignoring my correspondence, Pansy said primly. I didn't realize you were sulking. So sorry to have disturbed you. She made as though to leave and heard Draco sigh irritably behind her. With a smile, she looked back over her shoulder and said sweetly, unless you'd like to be a big boy today. You're worse than Mother, Draco complained, dragging his feet over to the window to let in some afternoon light. Why do you think she recruited me? Pansy shot back. She inspected the bench at the end of Draco's bed, but thought better of sitting on it when she spied the pile of dirty socks camping out underneath. How long have you been wallowing? I'm not wallowing, Draco said, running hands through his hair as though he could undo days of bedhead in 30 seconds. I'm thinking. Good, because that's what I've been doing, too. Pansy stared at the socks until Draco found his wand and removed them from her presence. She sat and adjusted her skirts. What have you concluded, then? Draco pulled a chair out from the vanity and sat backwards in it, arms crossed over the back. Nothing. I'm just going in circles. Nothing makes any sense anymore. It has been difficult to reconcile it all, Pansy admitted. My parents cross-examined me at length, I bet everyone else's did, too, and it helped me see a few things more clearly. Draco rested his forehead on his arms and grumbled into his rumpled shirt, good for you. Looking back, there were so many things, we knew he was hiding something, but this. Even now, she marveled at it. He was a wholly different person. Fooling us is one thing, but we saw him with his family. Or we thought we did, Draco muttered. He could only have fooled Lord Black with extensive training. This was planned for much longer than the papers are speculating, I think. Pansy drummed her fingers on her knee, waiting for Draco to say something constructive. Her friend only shrugged. So what, Pansy? So, what are we going to do about it, Draco? Do. Nothing. Draco's voice was flat. Lifeless. She stared at him. You don't mean that. I have to, he snapped. There it was, real emotion sparked in the depths of his eyes as he glared at her. Do you know what that sneak did to me? He called in the life debt. Draco stood and threw the chair sideways, where it collided into a wall with a crunching noise she hoped he found satisfying. Lord Malfoy really ought to set a better example. I'm forbidden from looking for him. As if I'd want to. Draco cast a blasting curse at the crumpled chair and it burst violently into pieces. You're still angry with him, then? What else should I be? Draco snarled. Supportive. Forgiving. That's what a friend would do, and he made it pretty damn clear that our friendship was a complete lie from the start. Draco Pansy started, but he was already in full ranting mode. He was just trying to get in good with my family, Pansy. To get leverage over us in case he got caught. He used me, used all of us to get what he wanted, and then, Draco's breath came in rapid pants, so Pansy finished his sentence for him. Then he left. And it hurt. Draco bared his teeth at her and she resisted the urge to slap the manners back into him physically. She would do it verbally, instead. Weeks of thinking has gotten you nowhere, I see. You weren't there, Pansy. I caught him erasing traces of himself in our dorm room. You didn't hear what he said. Forget what he said. Pansy rose to her feet and looked down her perfect nose at her perfectly obtuse friend. Honestly, Draco. You find out your best friend has lied to you for 4 years and then you decide to believe everything he says. Draco froze. Pansy gentled her tone but not the steel in her gaze. Is Rigel Black a liar, or is he not? Draco closed his mouth, cleared his throat, and addressed her with considerably more deference. What exactly are you saying, Pansy? That if Rigel's purpose was to stop you from coming after him, then he succeeded on multiple fronts. Pansy moved forward to put a hand on Draco's face. Didn't you use your empathy at all? She was close enough to see his cheeks grow ruddy. I was too upset. I suppressed it before the last task, and then everything was so confusing. I could barely get hold of my own emotions, much less parse through his. I'm sure he saw to that, Pansy said. Boys were completely hopeless. I admit I didn't foresee him using the life debt in this manner. Is your father bound, too? All the Malfoys, he confirmed. As we took the debt on as a family. Can't blame Rigel for that one, Pansy said dryly. Merlin saved her from the pride of men. Very well. Leave this to me. You. Draco frowned at her. Of course. I haven't been sitting in my room for 3 weeks, Draco. Millie is checking with her family's contacts abroad. We can't assume we know what he really looks like, but he knew enough about purebloods to pass as one of us from the start. Pansy began to pace the room. Either he had a lot of training, or his family is recently impure and he was raised without traditions. I think the latter more likely, given the time frame. His English is perfect, but my father heard from a friend at the ministry that the Eras are looking closely at the old French lines. They think he's a bastard. Draco seemed surprised by the notion. Pansy wasn't sure how he had rationalized away Rigel's parcel tongue in the last few weeks, but she reflected the lack of his input might not be a real loss for the investigation. Or an orphan. Think about it, how could he have gone 4 years without his own people wondering where he was? Aside from last summer when he was out of touch, he's been in England more or less constantly for 4 years. That internship in the Americas, he never was in the Darien Gap, was he? Probably not. When you accept that there are 3 of them rather than 2, it's easier to sort through the things that are distinctly air black and those that are purely Rigel. 3 of them. Pansy blinked at him. Rigel, air black, and Miss Potter, of course. Draco blinked back. What do you think Potter has to do with it? Saw laser, he was slower than usual. There's absolutely no way she wasn't in on it, Pansy said slowly. Fooling your parent is one thing, but Harriet Potter and her cousin are closer than close. Looking back over their interactions, don't they seem a little too close? In retrospect, Rigel dodged questions from a lot of people over the years. His family did seem confused sometimes, though I brushed it off as him not telling them everything, But Harriet was never confused. She never once questioned him, did she? They defended one another in every situation, and at least some of those times it was Rigel, not Archerus. But if she knew? Draco shook his head. She'd never admit it. Naturally, as I'd imagine she doesn't relish a stay in Azkaban prison. Her cousin has shielded her by claiming full responsibility. She can claim ignorance with the rest of her family, at least to some extent. That doesn't change the fact that she knew. She certainly knew Eblack was in America using her name to enroll in one of their schools, and I would be very surprised if she didn't know who Rigel was and where he came from, too. The picture was obvious, once you had all the pieces. Pansy caught Draco's gaze and held it confidently. Black and Potter are the keys. Their families can't keep them hidden away forever. We'll find him, Draco, and then we'll make him explain everything. Everything, Draco repeated, holding her eyes almost desperately. Just don't give up on him in the meantime, Pansy implored. The boy who needs your friendship now more than ever was real, Drake, and he is out there alone somewhere in a lot of trouble. She took his hand and squeezed it, relieved when he squeezed hers back. We always knew he was in over his head with something, Draco said, a quiver to his voice. We just didn't understand how far under the surface he was living. -0. HP. -0. It was a month before James let her leave the house. One trip to Tate's and back, he said from the top of the basement stairs. Harry looked up from her cauldron, scarcely daring to hope. James eyed the potion with resignation that was not entirely bad-humored. Only because you're driving your mother crazy going through the pantry. Harry stirred the very large vat of tea in her cauldron and fought a small smile. That was the idea. I'll be back before sundown, she promised. You'll be back in 1 hour exactly, or your cauldrons will be confiscated. My studies. Don't insult either of us, Harry. Potions is the last subject you require any additional practice in. Harry bit her tongue before the argument could devolve further. Before James closed the door behind him, she called, "Thanks, Dad." 1 hour. Harry scrambled for her list and dashed up the stairs. She slid into a pair of trainers she'd left near the back porch and took a couple of her mother's shopping bags from the hook near the keys. Before anyone could change their minds, she was through the flue. Stepping into the apothecary was like coming home. She breathed in the herbs, pickling fluids, and chemicals. Rather than wandering the aisles first, Harry went straight to the counter. "Mr. Tate, if I make a big order, can you have most of it delivered?" Tate peered at her a bit strangely. "Certainly, I can do that, miss." "Oh." She put a hand to her face and cursed her own stupidity. "It's me, Harriet Potter." "Miss Potter." Tate's eyes flew wide and realization set in. "Ah. I had heard some rumors that, well, no consequence. Forgive me for not recognizing you." "Not at all," she said, her stomach falling a bit. She fingered the end of the plain ribbon she'd been using to try and tame her exuberant curls. "I have changed a bit. I don't know exactly what you heard, but I imagine some of those rumors are true," she added, figuring she may as well face it head on. "I've been using an altered appearance for several years. Now I'm just me again, though." "Oh." Tate scratched his curly head uncomfortably for a moment, then settled on, "Well, it'll be no trouble recognizing you in the future, then, Miss Potter. I hope your presence here indicates you intend to continue patronizing this shop for some time to come." Tate smiled generously at her, and she smiled back. "Thank you, Mr. Tate. I certainly don't know where else I'd go for such quality supplies. What are you in need of today, then?" She showed him her list and set about collecting the ingredients she wanted to inspect personally while leaving the bulk items to him. She'd have liked to spend a good deal longer browsing, but thought her father would appreciate it if she were back sooner than absolutely required. Harry stuck to her list, and was back at the counter with her baskets just as Tate finished ringing the rest of it up on his till. Looking at the heap of fresh ingredients, Harry couldn't help but feel a little anticipatory. Pillaging the pantry hadn't been strictly necessary, but she had been scraping the bottom of her stores. "How much of this do you want to carry out?" Tate asked. She plucked a handful of items for a potion she wanted to try later that evening. "Just these." The rest are fine to be delivered. Your usual tab. If you don't mind. Could you confirm your account number? Just as, your appearance has altered significantly, Miss Potter. She grimaced. Of course, Mr. Tate. I appreciate your attention to security. Harry rattled off her Gringotts information and made a mental note to get a new wand before someone required more stringent identification from her. Mr. Tate began ferrying her purchases to the storeroom for later packaging, and Harry collected the empty baskets to stack back in their place by the door. The bell jangled and she stepped to the side automatically to avoid the other customer coming in. If it isn't little Miss Homeless. She looked up from arranging the baskets and her eyebrows flew upwards. Silas Lestrange shut the door behind him, looking more disgustingly smug than usual. Somehow, you're even uglier than you were, half-blood. Lestrange, she said flatly. How did you even recognize me? He gave her the most insulting of once-overs and smirked. Who else could you be? What does that mean? Harry looked down at her brewing robes, utterly confused as to how he'd managed what Tate hadn't, when Tate had known her so much longer. Lestrange ignored her. I heard you haven't been in America all these years after all, he said. Something about the anticipation in his voice made her think he'd been dying to rib her about the scandal. They are saying you slept on the streets of London to let your pure-blood cousin lark it up across the pond in your place. That's ridiculous, Harry said, scowling. Lestrange made a moue of mock sympathy. You know, you could have crashed with me if you were so desperate. She clicked her tongue. Let's not be utterly absurd. What's absurd is the idea of you slumming it in the alleys for 4 years instead of attending school like a normal person. Lestrange sneered, and she saw through it to the jealousy beneath. It's no wonder you've come up with so many incongruously insane new potioneering methods. You had all the time in the world, and no idea what right even looked like, didn't you? Harry put a hand on her hip and made a face at him. I'm sure there's a compliment in there, but as usual, it's buried under 2 decades of prejudice and rubbish. Haven't you heard, Lestrange? Different is the new normal. Lestrange gave a low, fake laugh. Don't tell me you buy into that new wave trite. Nothing has changed, dummy. You're still you and I'm still me. There will never be a world where you're not a freak and I'm not in charge. You're really an ass sometimes, Harry said through gritted teeth. The world is changing course whether you like it or not, Lestrange. You can adapt to it, or drown in it. I think I understand the world better than you, street rat. Harry shook her head. I don't have time to keep arguing with you, unfortunately. Fun as this is, I'm expected at home. I'm surprised your daddy let you out of his sight, Lestrange said sweetly. I bet you, your cousin, and that little blood thief you abetted set his career back 20 years. Harry pressed her lips together, but the question slipped out anyway. What did you do with your dose of Liber Espire? Lestrange went still. I sold it. She narrowed her eyes. You, who collect priceless ingredients for the pride of it, sold a potion. I don't think so. He was on the attack before she could register the snarl on his face. I suppose you're angry about me helping your little friend's opponent. If I'd known it was going to a mudblood, I wouldn't have given it up. He leaned in close enough to hiss. By the way, you may have everyone fooled, but I don't believe for a moment you didn't know that imposter was a half-blood. I bet you loved watching him win, making a fool of every pureblood there. He did do that, didn't he? She spat. It wasn't a real competition, brat. How could it prove anything? There wasn't even a pureblood in the finals. Harry shook her head in slow disbelief. Because the half-blood beat them both. She didn't understand the intractable hate in his eyes. She couldn't comprehend his point of view at all. What did it cost him, who had everything, to admit that a half-blood was good at something? Quietly, she asked, did you make the potion for the ritual? She'd been furiously researching it for weeks, trying to figure out what sort of powers it might give the construct, even botched as the magical transfer had been. She'd determined it had to be a new invention, as even her darkest texts made no mention of anything similar. She recalled a letter from Cray, who had been pressed hard for the identity of his brewer. She remembered a letter from Lestrange in which he'd boasted of someone taking an interest in his ability to shape imbue. Lestrange's face went perfectly blank, and she supposed that was answer enough. "I don't know what you're rambling about," he whispered. "Teaching you was a mistake," she said. He jerked away from her and yanked a basket from the stack on his way past. Harry stared sightlessly at the floor for a long moment. The bell chimed again, jerking her out of the dark pit of what-ifs. A middle-aged woman bustled into the shop and Harry slipped out the door behind her. Her feet turned home, but a familiar voice rooted her in place. "Harry." Leo was waiting for her, leaned up against Tate's apothecary like he'd been there forever, and always would be there. Harry was acutely aware of how different she looked, how different she felt, and how long it had been since they'd met. Of how errors had come knocking on doors in the alleys because of her. Of how no one on Dogwood Lane gave her up or contradicted the story she gave Mrs. Botting in any way. Of how she owed him and everyone he represented a debt that could never be repaid. Leo gave her a long look, then reached out to twist a curl between his fingers. "It suits you." Her lip wobbled, and she wanted to die. "Leo." "I." He produced a knife from his sleeve, and she stiffened. It was hers, or rather, it was the one he'd given her. Last she'd seen it, the blade was dripping with Barty's blood. "Nicked this off the Yunera watching the evidence boxes that night," he said, flipping it slowly. "Recognized it at once in the mirror." Harry tried to swallow. "I gave it to Rigel for the tournament. Just in case." Leo caught her gaze and didn't let go. "Margot saw your boots below a hooded cloak, running through the alleys the morning after the last task. I know it was you, lass." She didn't give her tears permission to fall, but they did anyway. She didn't tell her legs to move forward and she was pretty sure she didn't tell her head to bury itself in Leo's shoulder, but however it happened she was crying, he was holding her, and the cracks of the last month gave way with a wrenching sob and, "Oh, Harry. What have you gotten yourself into?" She shattered into pieces. -0, 0, 0. -0, 0. -0. End of chapter 14. The futile faked. Epilogue. The rain that dashed itself against the windows didn't stir him. The wind howling at the shutters couldn't move him. He was calm. Focused. He had to be, or the divination was all but useless. Severus bent low over a large map, intention in every fiber as he drew his magic through the array with ruthless control. At the center of the runes, a cluster of fluorescent green spheres glowed softly, perfectly imbued far beyond the natural life of such things. Retaining the magical signature of the one who imbued them years before. The crystal beneath his right hand grew scalding as it absorbed the magic in the array. At the last possible moment, when it was so hot he risked third-degree burns across his palm, he released it. The crystal lurched into the air and hung suspended over the map in quivering uncertainty. Slowly, as he began to strain with the effort of keeping the array active, the crystal lilted, tilted, and slid sideways to hover unerringly over southeast England. Severus released the magic with a gasp, vindicated. The boy hadn't left the country. His scrying was not accurate enough to geolocate his wayward pupil, but he was nonetheless satisfied. Let the offended imbeciles scour the continent for him. Severus would find the teen in his own time. Straightening, he fixed his sights on the pristine apron in the corner. It hung limp, abandoned, with no evidence it had ever been worn at all. A potioneer like Rigel couldn't hide his talents forever. -0. TRTRTR. -0. The boy had ruined everything. The legislation needed to save the magical world in tatters, votes evaporated in the boil of public outrage. To add insult to injury, he'd managed to hamstring his right-hand man on the way out. Lucius and all his resources, useless. Anger simmered into incredulity, and the dregs of that congealed to insatiable curiosity, and he had to know. How could the boy have done this? And who was he? His spies at the ministry reported the boy was European, French, possibly. Speculation put him the bastard of an old line, and naturally so, his magic was too great to be otherwise explained. Parseltongue was not a trait that ran in European lines, however. He should know. He had traced the line extensively, perhaps further than anyone else. If not a black, he could only be the byblow of another family intermingled with the Peveril brothers. He would find the boy. The door to his study creaked open, and Jacob Owen strode through it with a sour expression. Speaking of long-lost Slytherin heirs. Dash 0, 0, 0. Dash 0, 0. Minus 0. End of Book 4.